Hello? I'm in my late 30s. I've always had girlfriends, but never felt confident enough to get married. So I've been living single. I majored in Chinese and lived in China for over 5 years. At the request of an acquaintance last summer, I started tutoring a first grader named Oliver in Chinese. Oliver, having graduated from an English kindergarten, speaks English well, but was also eager to learn Chinese. So I was introduced by a mutual friend to tutor him. I happily agreed to also help him prepare for Chinese proficiency exams. Oliver's family home was quite spacious and well organized. When I first met Oliver's mother, I was struck by her beauty. She looked like she was in her mid-20s, though she said she was in her early 30s, having married right after college. She was slim and tall, easily over 5'7". Oliver, taking after his mother, was a handsome boy with distinct features. He was a bright child, understanding more than what was taught, doing his homework well and having good pronunciation. He has a 3-year-old sister who was incredibly cute. I heard Oliver's grandmother lived in the same apartment complex and would often come over to look after her grandchildren. I had the chance to meet her during my first lesson. Oliver's mother mentioned she needed to go to a community center for her daughter's class, so she asked her mother to stay with Oliver during our Chinese lessons. Oliver's grandmother, also quite beautiful, seemed to have passed down her looks. She mentioned she was preparing to become a senior model and needed to practice for interviews in English and Chinese. After Oliver's lesson, she expressed a desire to have private lessons at her place on a different day, since she needed to look after her granddaughter. I informed her of my availability, and we agreed on weekly lessons every Friday afternoon at her home. Despite offering a family discount, she insisted on paying the full price, mentioning she heard her grandson was enjoying the lessons and learning well. She humbly asked for patience as she might learn slower due to her age. I learned she was in her mid-50s, but she was very motivated and had surprisingly good pronunciation, and it was lovely to see her practice consistently. She mentioned she had a lot to do besides foreign language interviews. For starters, she takes care of her appearance and gets treatments at a local skincare clinic. She also makes it a point to shower at home and apply a facial mask every day. She offered to help me with a mask after class when we had a moment, and I agreed. You just have to sit in a chair and apply it, but lying down on the couch and relaxing for 20 minutes works too, she said. Having only ever used lotion my whole life, that day was my first time trying a face mask. I didn't like the cold feeling of the mask sheet on my face, but after washing it off, my skin tone seemed noticeably brighter. Having a job that requires a lot of talking, my throat often feels scratchy, and I need to present a clean appearance to my students. Realizing I hadn't been taking care of my skin made me think I should start. None of my past girlfriends ever paid attention to my skin, but I found Oliver's grandmother to be quite thoughtful. One day after class, she showed me a home workout channel on YouTube. The exercises looked easy to follow at a glance. "Would you like to try it?" she asked. So we turned on the smart TV in the living room and started exercising. It looked easy, but I was sweating profusely after a while. As I was fanning myself, she said, "I'm sweating too, so I'm going to take a quick shower. You should take one too," and went to the bedroom. I never imagined what would happen next when we exercised. I noticed her body didn't have an ounce of fat. Impressive for someone in her 50s. The bathroom had a pleasantly scented soap, not some cheap supermarket brand, but a pretty natural soap. After lightly washing up and changing clothes, she came out in a cute home dress. Honestly, I was a bit smitten. It was my first time feeling this way about an older woman. Thanks to Oliver's grandmother, I got to do a face mask and exercise. It was so much fun, I said as I was leaving. She looked at me and said, "If you have time, let's have a beer." I was planning to have a beer at home anyway, so it worked out well, and I sat down on the couch. She brought out homemade sweet potato chips and stout. I've been having so much fun preparing to be a senior model. I've always exercised and taken care of my skin, but studying with you has been such a joy, she said. Her mood turned somber as she recalled her late husband. She mentioned that Oliver's mom passed away from a terrible illness within 2 months of getting sick while she was in college. The thought of living without her husband was daunting, but she smiled and said that those who are left behind must go on living. She moved closer to her daughter to alleviate her loneliness by spending time with her grandchildren. She also mentioned that becoming a senior model was her son-in-law's suggestion, noting that she hadn't seen anyone her age with such good skin and youthful appearance. I cautiously asked if she still felt lonely without her husband. She admitted that while being busy with her grandchildren keeps her mind off her late husband, she feels truly alone when she returns home. She expressed skepticism about the men others have tried to introduce to her, wishing for someone cultured like me. Our connection was undeniable, and by the next morning, I had come to my senses. Unable to wait for our next lesson, I found myself at her house late at night. I'm unsure if it's appropriate to continue this relationship with my student. She's been widowed for over 10 years and hinted at the difficulty of those years, making it hard for me to leave her alone.
I came home that evening like I always did, tired from a long day at work, but glad to be back. The house was quiet, except for the unmistakable sound of my wife's voice echoing from the living room. She was on the phone, and not just casually chatting either. She was practically yelling with excitement, her words spilling out so fast I could barely make sense of them. Curious, I stepped into the room and gave her a questioning look, but before I could say anything, she shot me a glare, not one of those leave me alone looks, but a sharp, almost angry expression. It stopped me in my tracks. I leaned against the doorway, waiting for her to finish. As soon as she noticed me, her tone shifted abruptly. She dropped her voice to a whisper, barely audible over the hum of the air conditioner. That was unusual. Normally, she didn't care if I overheard her conversations. This time, though, it was like she didn't want me knowing what she was saying. I crossed my arms and waited, but she seemed in no rush to hang up. I'm not one to pry, so I left her to it and went to the kitchen to grab a drink, but the whole thing didn't sit right with me. When she finally ended the call and walked into the kitchen, I decided to ask. "What was that all about?" I said, keeping my tone casual. Her response took me off guard. "I'm tired of this routine, that's what," she snapped. "Do you even realize how long it's been since we've gone anywhere or done anything fun?" Her sudden outburst left me staring at her for a moment. This wasn't the first time she'd brought up the monotony of our lives, but the venom in her voice was new. "Are you serious?" I shot back. "You don't even work. I'm the one who busts my ass every day to keep this house running. What do you expect? That I quit my job so we can go live it up? Because, newsflash, we wouldn't last a month without my paycheck." My words hit a nerve. She didn't say anything, just turned on her heel and stormed off to the bedroom, leaving me standing there. Hours passed in silence. I wasn't one to dwell on arguments, but I'd be lying if I said her reaction didn't bother me. Eventually, she came back out, her tone calmer but her words no less surprising. "I'm sorry," she said. "Maybe I overreacted. But listen, my friend invited me to this gathering. It's supposed to be really exclusive and, well, kind of secretive. Her relatives are organizing it, and it's all themed around the 1950s. Costumes, jazz, blues, you name it. Apparently, there will even be special guests. I'm not sure what else to expect, but it sounds exciting." She paused for a moment, then added, "I would invite you, but it's during the day, and you've got work. Don't worry, though, I'll tell you all about it. Maybe I'll even sneak something back from the buffet for you." That last comment made me laugh despite myself. "All right," I said, shaking my head. "Have fun, I guess." Later that night, as we got ready for bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something about the whole thing was off. A secretive 1950s themed event? Special guests? Why all the mystery? The more I thought about it, the less sense it made. As I lay there staring at the ceiling, I couldn't help but wonder, what kind of event was this, and why was it so hush-hush? The question lingered in my mind as I drifted off to sleep. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of my wife bustling around the bedroom. It was earlier than usual, and as I rubbed the sleep out of my eyes, I saw her standing in front of the mirror. She was dressed in a tight black dress that looked like it belonged on the red carpet. Her makeup was flawless, her hair styled to perfection. It was such a stark contrast to her usual laid-back morning routine that I barely recognized her. Before I could say anything, she grabbed her bag, shot me a quick glance, and darted out of the house without a word. I sat on the edge of the bed for a moment, trying to process what just happened. She wasn't one to dress up like that without a reason, let alone rush out so early. Usually, any events she attended started much later in the day. I told myself it wasn't worth overthinking, not yet, at least. Work wasn't going to wait for me, so I got ready and headed out, still mulling over her unusual behavior. At the office, I brought it up casually with a couple of colleagues during lunch. One of them, a guy who'd been around the block more times than he cared to admit, gave me a knowing look. "You ever heard of those secret parties?" he said. I shook my head, and he went on to explain some wild story about an exclusive swinger event he'd attended years ago. According to him, the dress code was exactly the kind of thing my wife had been wearing that morning. "If I were you," he said, leaning in, "I'd think twice about what's really going on." The comment sat with me for the rest of the day. I wasn't the type to jump to conclusions, but the secrecy, the early morning exit, and now this suggestion from a coworker, it all felt a bit too coincidental. Still, I told myself not to get carried away. Maybe it was just a regular outing with her friend, like she'd mentioned the night before. But the thought of what else it could be lingered in the back of my mind, gnawing at me. When work finally wrapped up, I drove home, half expecting some kind of explanation or at least a sign of normalcy. Instead, I walked into the house and found her sprawled out on the couch, clutching a half-empty bottle of what looked like expensive whiskey. She was completely out of it, her dress slightly rumpled, her makeup smudged. The sight of her like that stopped me in my tracks. My chest tightened, and a flood of thoughts raced through my head. I stood there for a minute, staring at her, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The alcohol, the state she was in, the silence, it all pointed to something I didn't want to acknowledge. My mind jumped to the worst possible conclusion: she had cheated on me. The idea was like a punch to the gut, but I wasn't about to start making accusations without proof. I needed answers, and the only place I knew to start was her phone. Carefully, I reached for it where it sat on the coffee table. Unlocking it, I braced myself for what I might find. Messages, photos, call logs, anything that could confirm or deny my growing suspicions. But to my surprise, there was nothing. No strange messages, no unusual contacts, no evidence of anything out of the ordinary. It was almost too clean, which only made me more uneasy. I set the phone down and turned my attention back to her. She was still out cold, the bottle now slipping from her hand. Whatever had happened, I wasn't going to get answers tonight. I gently took the bottle from her, set it aside, and lifted her into my arms. She stirred slightly but didn't wake as I carried her to the bedroom and laid her down. As I pulled the blanket over her, I resolved to get to the bottom of it in the morning. Tomorrow was a day off, and I wasn't going to let this go unanswered. For now, though, all I could do was wait and hope that whatever explanation she had would make sense of this whole mess. The next morning, I was jolted awake by the sound of my wife's voice. She stood by the bed, shaking my shoulder. Before I even fully opened my eyes, I was hit with a wave of irritation. Who wakes someone up like that after a night like the one she had? I sat up and looked at her, still groggy but already brimming with questions. But before I could say anything, my frustration boiled over. "Who were you with last night?" I demanded, my voice louder than I intended. She stared at me like I had just grown a second head. "Are you serious?" she said. "I was with you. I came home, and you put me to bed. Did you hit your head or something?" Her calm response only made me angrier. "You left early in the morning, dressed to the nines, and came back drunk with a bottle of whiskey," I shot back. "Don't play dumb with me. I know what happens at those kinds of events." Her face twisted in confusion and then annoyance. "What events? What are you even talking about?" she asked, crossing her arms. "You sound ridiculous. Who's been filling your head with this nonsense?" I wasn't about to back down. "One of my colleagues told me," I said. "He knows about these secret parties. I'm not blind, and I'm not stupid." She let out an exasperated sigh and rolled her eyes. "Your colleague is an idiot," she said flatly. "And so are you if you actually believe him." Before I could retort, she pulled out her phone. "You want proof?" "Fine," she said, her fingers flying over the screen. "My friend's about to send me the pictures from last night. Give it 10 minutes, and you'll see exactly what we were up to." Her confidence threw me off, but I stayed silent, watching as she texted her friend. She put the phone down and crossed her arms again, staring at me like she was daring me to say something else. Sure enough, a few minutes later, her phone buzzed. She opened the message and handed it to me. The screen was filled with photos and videos of her and her friend at what appeared to be a very upscale restaurant. The images showed nothing suspicious, just them smiling for the camera, surrounded by plates of gourmet food and glasses of wine. The videos captured a live jazz performance, complete with a full band and dim, atmospheric lighting. There was nothing incriminating about any of it. "See," she said, her tone sharp. "This is what I was doing. Eating, drinking, and listening to music. No secret parties, no swinging, none of that garbage your colleague fed you. Feel stupid yet?" I handed her phone back, my jaw clenched. She might have been telling the truth about the photos, but I wasn't ready to let it go just yet. "Fine," I said. "But what were you doing there, really? You don't even like jazz." She rolled her eyes again and sat down on the edge of the bed. "I told you," she said. "I went to support my friend. She's the one who got the invitation, not me. I barely talked to anyone there." Honestly, most of the night was her chatting with some older guy who turned out to be related to the people hosting the event. Her next words caught me off guard. "Actually, that guy mentioned something about a job for me," she said. "Apparently, he's looking for someone with my charisma. It sounds interesting, but I don't know much yet. He invited both of us to dinner next weekend to talk about it. I made it very clear I have a husband, and he said that's even better." I leaned back, trying to process everything she had just said. A job? With some older guy she barely knew? And now he wanted to meet us both? Something about it didn't sit right with me. As she got up to leave the room, I made a mental note. Whoever this guy was, I was going to figure him out. No way was I letting this slide without knowing exactly what he wanted with my wife. The days leading up to the weekend were more of the same. My wife was glued to her phone, chatting endlessly with her friend. Every time I tried to press her for details, she would just brush me off with a vague response or tell me I'd find out soon enough. Once, I even called her friend directly, hoping to get some clarity, but she laughed and said, "You'll see when you get there." It was maddening. Meanwhile, my wife spent her evenings trying on different outfits. Dresses, heels, accessories, our bedroom turned into her personal dressing room. She didn't share much with me about her plans, and I was left to watch the show with growing curiosity and irritation. Finally, the day arrived. We drove together to the restaurant, an upscale place with valet parking and chandeliers visible through the windows. As we stepped inside, I couldn't help but feel slightly out of place, even in my best suit. My wife, on the other hand, looked like she belonged there, her outfit perfectly chosen for the occasion. Across the room, her friend waved enthusiastically, guiding us to a table where an older man was already seated. He stood up as we approached, smiling warmly, and shook my hand firmly. "Good evening," he said. "Thank you for coming. I understand how this might look, especially to you," he added, addressing me directly. That piqued my interest immediately. What exactly was this meeting about, and why was he so quick to acknowledge my presence? I took a seat, keeping my guard up as the man continued. He introduced himself as the owner of a company that organizes auctions, but not the kind I had initially imagined. "Let me explain," he said. "Years ago, your wife's friend's parents helped me during a very difficult time in my life. Since then, I've considered her almost like a daughter. When I met your wife, I couldn't help but notice her presence. She has the perfect demeanor and appearance for what we do. Our auctions are elegant affairs, and having the right person to present the lots is crucial. Your wife, I believe, would be an excellent fit." His words were carefully chosen, and while they seemed complimentary, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. I glanced at my wife, who listened intently, her expression a mix of curiosity and intrigue. The man continued, "These aren't the fast-talking, high-pressure auctions you might be imagining. Everything is conducted at a relaxed pace, with a focus on style and sophistication. It's less about speed and more about creating an atmosphere. I assure you, it's straightforward work, and I personally guarantee her safety and well-being." The more he spoke, the more I found myself softening to the idea. It didn't sound as shady as I'd initially feared, though I still had questions. For now, I held my tongue and let the conversation unfold. My wife thanked him for the opportunity, and before long, the dinner wrapped up. As we were getting ready to leave, he added, "Your first day will be Monday. There's a special auction coming up, and I'd like you to be the one to handle it. Just remember, the items being auctioned are confidential, so discretion is key." My wife agreed without hesitation, promising to keep everything under wraps. On the drive home, she seemed excited, talking about how interesting the evening had been. "I'm really looking forward to seeing what this is all about," she said. "The secrecy makes it even more intriguing." Her enthusiasm was almost contagious, but I couldn't ignore the nagging thoughts in the back of my mind. "You'll tell me what's going on, right?" I asked. She hesitated for a moment before replying, "Of course, but only what I'm allowed to. I don't want to risk losing the job before I even start. Still, if there's anything I can share, I will." Her tone was reassuring, but it didn't do much to ease my concerns. As we pulled into the driveway, her last words lingered in my mind. "I'm so curious about this assignment," she said, practically glowing. "It sounds like it'll be something really special." I nodded, keeping my own thoughts to myself. Whatever this secretive auction entailed, I was going to find out, one way or another. The week started like any other, with my wife getting ready for her new job. As I drank my morning coffee, she mentioned that her friend would be picking her up. I didn't think much of it until I heard the unmistakable purr of an engine outside. When I glanced out the window, I was floored. Her friend pulled up in a sleek, black Mercedes that looked like it cost more than our house. My wife's jaw dropped too when she stepped outside. She turned back to wave at me, an expression of surprise still plastered on her face, before hopping into the car and driving off. The sight of that car lingered in my mind throughout the day. I knew her friend came from a well-off family, but this was next-level wealth. It made me wonder what kind of circles my wife was stepping into with this job. Still, I reminded myself not to jump to conclusions. She seemed genuinely excited about the work, and I had no reason yet to doubt her intentions. By the end of the week, she was glowing whenever she talked about her new role. "It's honestly so simple," she told me one evening. "I just present the items, announce the bids, and smile. That's it. Everyone's so professional and respectful. It's almost too easy." Her enthusiasm was infectious, though I couldn't help but prod a little. "Nobody's tried anything with you?" I asked, half joking. "Not a chance," she replied firmly. "Most of them are older, married, and honestly not even interested. Besides, I'm nothing special compared to their wives." Her answer put me at ease, at least for the moment. The routine seemed to settle in smoothly. Every morning, her friend arrived in that Mercedes to pick her up, and every evening, she returned home with stories about the day. Nothing out of the ordinary happened, which was both a relief and a source of mild curiosity. I'd expected more drama, given the secretive nature of the job, but it all seemed above board so far. Then, midway through dinner one evening, my phone buzzed. It was my boss, and the tone of the call immediately shifted my mood. "We've got a series of business trips coming up," he said, "and your presence is absolutely essential. These won't be back-to-back, but you'll be traveling on and off for the next few weeks." Before I could respond, he hung up, leaving me staring at the phone in disbelief. My wife noticed my expression right away. "What's wrong?" she asked, concern flashing across her face. I explained the situation, frustrated by the abruptness of it all. "So, I'll be gone for stretches of time, starting next Monday," I said, setting the phone down. "That's just how it is, apparently." She nodded, her face softening. "It's okay," she said. "We'll manage. Besides, some time apart might be good for us. We'll miss each other, and it'll make the time we do have together even better." Her calm response surprised me, but before I could dwell on it, she added something that piqued my curiosity. "Actually, it's probably for the best," she said with a sly smile. "I've got something big coming up at work. It's a surprise, but trust me, it's going to blow your mind when I tell you about it. You won't believe it." I raised an eyebrow, intrigued despite myself. "What kind of surprise?" I asked. She shook her head, laughing. "Nice try, but you'll have to wait. Just focus on your trips, and when you're back, I'll fill you in on everything. I promise it'll be worth the wait." Her words left me both curious and cautious. Whatever this big thing was, it seemed important to her, and I wasn't going to push her for answers before she was ready. Still, as the days ticked by and my departure loomed closer, I couldn't help but wonder what exactly she had gotten herself into. The week-long business trip dragged on, each day feeling longer than the last. I kept in touch with my wife during the evenings, but our conversations were frustratingly vague. She seemed cheerful enough, but when I brought up the secret event she had mentioned before I left, she shut it down immediately. "I can't talk about it over the phone," she said, her voice carrying an edge of excitement. "I'll tell you everything when you get back." That only made me more impatient. By the fourth day, I couldn't stop thinking about how strange this all felt. Between her cryptic hints and the secrecy surrounding her job, my life was beginning to feel like some kind of low-budget spy movie. I resolved to get to the bottom of it as soon as I got home. Whatever she was hiding, it was time for some straight answers. When I finally returned, she was already waiting for me at the door, smiling from ear to ear. Her excitement seemed genuine, which threw me off guard. I half expected her to be defensive or evasive, but instead, she ushered me inside like I was late for something important. "Come on," she said. "Let's get you settled. You won't believe what I have to tell you." Once we were in the kitchen, she made us coffee and sat across from me, her energy practically radiating across the table. "All right," I said, cutting to the chase. "What was this big event you couldn't talk about?" She took a sip of her coffee, savoring the moment before launching into her story. It was a huge banquet, she began. The kind you only see in movies. The food, the music, the people, everything was over-the-top extravagant. And then came the highlight of the evening. They auctioned off a night with a famous actress. My jaw practically hit the floor. A night? I asked, narrowing my eyes. What exactly does that mean? She rolled her eyes, clearly expecting my reaction. Not like that, she said. It's just an evening, a dinner, conversation, maybe some photos. Nothing inappropriate. But people were bidding insane amounts of money for it. The final bid was in the millions. As I tried to wrap my head around the absurdity of it, she continued. And that's not even the craziest part, she said, her tone dropping into something more serious. Do you remember how I told you my friend's family is close with my boss? Well, apparently, years ago, he was involved in some pretty shady business. He got into serious trouble, and her family helped him out. That's why he's so loyal to them now. The revelation didn't sit well with me. And he's not worried about that coming back to bite him? I asked. She shrugged. Honestly, I think he's beyond caring. He's got so much money and influence now that it probably doesn't matter. People like him always seem to find a way to stay untouchable. Before I could respond, she leaned forward, her excitement returning. Speaking of events, she said, do you have a day off coming up? My friend invited us to dinner. It's a small gathering, but I've been looking forward to it for ages. The lifestyle, the atmosphere, it's all so different from what we're used to. I raised an eyebrow, still processing everything she'd told me. What exactly is this dinner about? I asked. She smiled mysteriously and shrugged. She didn't give me all the details, she admitted. But she made it clear you're invited too. It'll be interesting, I promise. On the weekend, we set off for the dinner, and I found myself surprisingly relaxed. With everything that had been going on, I'd almost forgotten about the mysterious secrecy surrounding the event. As we drove, I turned to my wife. So, what's with all the hush-hush? I asked. She glanced at me and smiled, as if she had been expecting the question. Look, she said, it's just how things work there. They sell rare cars, old paintings, and other expensive stuff. A lot of people don't want their purchases made public because it could spark controversy or gossip. That's why everything's so discreet. Her explanation made sense, but I couldn't help feeling there was more to it. When we arrived, the atmosphere was as grand as I expected. The building itself was a masterpiece, with towering pillars and gilded decor that screamed wealth. We were greeted warmly as soon as we stepped inside. My wife's friend waved us over, introducing us to a few key players in the room. Everything seemed normal at first, though the level of extravagance was slightly overwhelming. Later in the evening, an older man approached us with a younger guy by his side. The older man was polite and charming, introducing himself as the host. His son, however, was an entirely different story. The kid, and I do mean kid, had the kind of smug face you'd expect to see on someone who'd never been told no in his life. He carried himself like the world owed him everything, and his eyes immediately wandered where they shouldn't have, my wife's chest. I held my tongue for as long as I could, but by the third time I caught him staring, I had enough. Eyes up here, buddy, I said sharply. The older man's smile faltered for a moment, but then he chuckled and gave his son a swift smack on the back of the head. Where are your manners? He said, clearly embarrassed. This man is your guest. Show some respect. He turned to me, extending his hand. I like your directness, he said. It's refreshing. I shook his hand, nodding in appreciation. It wasn't every day someone backed me up like that. The son, however, wasn't done. He muttered something under his breath about meeting me again soon. It wasn't a threat, exactly, but it was odd enough to stick in my mind. I brushed it off for the moment and turned my attention back to the older man, who was now praising my wife. She's a natural, he said. Her work has brought in more money than I'd expected. You should be proud. I nodded, trying not to let my skepticism show. I was proud of her, sure, but I still had questions about this whole setup. As the evening progressed, the older man mentioned an upcoming auction, something much larger than the usual events. You'll want to congratulate your wife, he said. She's been instrumental in its planning. With her help, it's shaping up to be one of our most successful events yet. Then, almost as an afterthought, he added, she's told me about your work trips. It's unfortunate you have to be away so often, but perhaps we can find a way to involve you in the future. The comment struck me as odd, but I just thanked him politely and moved on. Throughout the rest of the evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that the younger guy was still watching us. Sure enough, I spotted him in the corner, showing off photos of his new red Jaguar to a small group of people. He seemed to be soaking up their admiration, but his eyes would occasionally dart back to us. It was unsettling, but I decided not to make a scene. By the time we left, the night felt like a blur of luxury and strange encounters. On the drive home, my wife's mood was light, and she seemed genuinely pleased with how the evening had gone. I nodded along as she talked about the auction and her plans for the next week, but my mind kept circling back to one thing, the younger guy's parting words. We'll meet again, he'd said. Was it a casual remark or something more? Either way, it left me uneasy. This dinner might have been our first introduction to that world, but something told me it wouldn't be our last. Back at home, I couldn't let the events of the previous evening slide. Over coffee, I turned to my wife and said, "You know that little punk? He spent the whole night ogling you, even after his father smacked him on the head. That's not sitting right with me." She raised an eyebrow but didn't seem too surprised. "Yeah, we've crossed paths a couple of times," she admitted. "But only because of my friend. Honestly, I thought you'd let it go. I kind of liked how you called him out, though. Shows you've got a spine." Her tone was light, but it didn't ease my irritation. Changing the subject, I mentioned my upcoming work trip. "This should be the last one for a while," I said. She sighed and nodded. "That's too bad," she replied. "I was hoping we'd get more time together. Especially since my big vacation is coming up soon. A lot of those people from the auction world are coming back into town for the season, and there's going to be a grand event. That's the secret one I told you about." Her excitement was clear, but all I could focus on was the timing. It felt like too much was happening while I'd be away. Once the trip started, the days felt routine at first. I stayed in touch with her, but our calls were brief and centered around mundane updates. Then, a message from my best friend, who also happens to be an attorney, disrupted the monotony. "Hey," he wrote. "Did you get a new car?" I frowned, confused. "No." "Why?" I replied. His next message made me sit up straight. "There's a bunch of luxury cars parked near your house. Among all the black ones, there's a bright red Jaguar that stands out. Just thought I'd check." That comment sent my thoughts racing. "Not mine," I texted back. "I'm out of town, so that's weird. I'll explain later, but can you swing by later and see if they're still there?" He agreed, promising to keep an eye on things. The red Jaguar was too specific a detail to ignore. I couldn't shake the image of that smug kid from the dinner party bragging about his flashy new car. As the day went on, I found myself unable to focus on work. The whole situation felt off. I texted my wife, casually asking if she'd noticed anything unusual at home, but her response was short and dismissive. "Everything's fine," she wrote. "Why do you ask?" That didn't do much to calm my nerves. Something was going on, and I hated being stuck hundreds of miles away, unable to figure it out. Later that evening, my friend followed up. "Cars are still there," he said. "Looks like some kind of meeting or party. Should I dig deeper?" I told him to hold off for now, but my gut was telling me to get home as soon as possible. Whatever was happening, it wasn't normal. The next morning, I made a decision. I called my boss, feigning illness. "I'm feeling awful," I said. "I've been sick all night, can barely keep anything down. I need to head back early. There was a pause on the line before he sighed. All right, he said. But I'll only be able to approve partial pay if you cut the trip short. I didn't care. That's fine, I replied. I just need to get home. As soon as the call ended, I packed my things and made arrangements to leave. I wasn't about to sit around any longer while strange cars parked outside my house and my wife brushed off every question. The sooner I got home, the sooner I'd get to the bottom of it. When I got home, it was late in the evening, and my friend had already texted me earlier to confirm that the cars were still parked outside my house. I decided to take a cautious approach. Leaving my car a few blocks away, I walked toward my home under the cover of darkness, staying out of sight. My heart pounded in my chest as I rounded the corner and approached the property. Something about this whole situation felt off, and I needed to see for myself what was going on. I circled around the house quietly, sticking to the shadows. As I approached one of the living room windows, I saw a scene that made my blood run cold. My wife stood at the center of the room, while several well-dressed individuals sat in chairs around her. Among them was the son of the older man from the dinner party. My wife was holding a marker and writing on a whiteboard, something to do with bids, it seemed. I pulled out my phone and began recording, feeling a knot tighten in my stomach as the scene unfolded. What happened next left me stunned. My wife, as if on cue, began removing her clothing piece by piece. The men in the room clapped and cheered as if this was all part of some sick show. I couldn't believe my eyes. She cheated on me with this guy. I kept the camera steady, capturing every detail while rage built up inside me. I had seen enough. Whatever excuses she might have had, this was beyond anything I could tolerate. After the guests had their fill, they began leaving one by one. Soon, only the son of the older man and my wife were left in the room. I realized this was my moment. Quietly, I made my way to the front door, unlocked it, and stepped inside. Without hesitation, I grabbed the pistol I kept for emergencies from its hiding spot and stormed into the living room. The shock on their faces when they saw me was almost satisfying. I pointed the gun directly at the younger man. "You've got 5 seconds to explain yourself," I said, my voice calm but laced with fury. He immediately raised his hands, stammering. "Please," he said, his voice trembling. "I'll give you whatever you want. Just don't do anything crazy." My wife, meanwhile, screamed for me to put the gun down, pleading with tears in her eyes. I ignored her and kept my focus on him. "Empty your pockets," I ordered. He fumbled with his jacket and pulled out a wad of cash that could have paid off my mortgage twice over. I grabbed it and gestured for him to keep talking. "Wait," he said. "I've got something else." He carefully slipped his pants on and headed toward the door. For a moment, I thought he was going to make a run for it, but instead, he walked to his car. A minute later, he returned holding a luxury watch. "Take this," he said. "It's worth more than you can imagine. Just let me go." I took the watch and motioned for him to leave. "Get out," I said. "If I ever see your face again, you won't get off this easy." He bolted out the door without another word. My wife tried to speak, but I held up a hand to stop her. "Not a word," I said. "I'll deal with you later." With the money and watch in hand, I left the house and drove to my parents' place. I needed time to think, away from her and all the chaos she'd brought into my life. I wasn't sure what my next move would be, but one thing was certain, I had a plan, and it would ensure that neither she nor anyone else involved in this mess would ever cross me again. When I returned home, I didn't waste any time. My wife was waiting, trying to act as though nothing had happened, but I wasn't interested in playing along. From now on, I told her firmly, this marriage happens on my terms. If you want to stay, you'll follow my rules. No questions, no negotiations. She looked startled but nodded, likely thinking I was just blowing off steam. She didn't realize I had already made up my mind. Later that evening, I called my best friend. "I need the number of a good divorce lawyer," I told him. He hesitated for a moment before giving it to me. "Are you sure about this?" he asked. "Completely," I replied. "But I don't want her to know yet. This needs to stay under wraps until I've got everything in place." He agreed, and I wasted no time contacting the lawyer and starting the process. For the next few weeks, I acted as though everything was fine. Meanwhile, I was working behind the scenes to secure my freedom. I gathered the necessary paperwork, set up meetings with the attorney, and prepared the evidence I had recorded. The video from that night was my trump card, and I knew exactly how I was going to use it. Once everything was ready, I released the footage anonymously to multiple media outlets. The fallout was immediate and explosive. The video went viral within hours, sparking outrage and widespread curiosity. Journalists dug into the people involved, and it wasn't long before the spotlight turned on the young man's father. With paparazzi now following his every move, skeletons from his past began surfacing: tax evasion, shady business deals, and more. His reputation crumbled overnight. As for my wife, the scandal hit her harder than I expected. Her employer didn't hesitate to cut ties, citing the negative attention as a liability. She was devastated, alternating between anger and desperation as she tried to figure out her next move. At first, she didn't suspect I had anything to do with it. But as days passed, I noticed her looking at me differently, as though she was starting to put the pieces together. One evening, she broke down completely, crying about how everything was falling apart. "I've lost my job," she sobbed. "I don't know what to do." Her tears didn't move me. Instead, I responded with a cold smile. "What a shame," I said. "Don't worry, though. I've got a surprise for you tomorrow. You're going to love it." She looked at me with a mixture of hope and confusion. "What kind of surprise?" she asked, wiping her eyes. "You'll see," I replied, keeping my tone light. Inside, though, I was already planning my next move. The divorce papers were ready, and tomorrow, I'd hand them to her along with a reality check she wouldn't forget. As I watched her retreat to the bedroom, I felt a strange sense of closure beginning to settle in. This wasn't just about ending the marriage, it was about reclaiming control of my life. Tomorrow would mark the start of something new, and I was more than ready for it. The call from the lawyer came early in the morning. "The divorce papers are finalized," he said. "You can hand them to her whenever you're ready." I thanked him and hung up, feeling a mixture of relief and anticipation. This was the moment I had been waiting for. That evening, I walked into the house with a wrapped box in hand, determined to see this through. When I presented the box to her, she looked at me with a confused smile. "What's this?" she asked, shaking it lightly. "Open it and see," I said, my expression giving nothing away. As soon as she lifted the lid and saw the documents inside, her face twisted in shock. "What is this?" she screamed. "You can't be serious. You're divorcing me? After everything we've been through?" Her anger quickly turned to hysteria. She threw the box across the room and began shouting, calling me every name under the sun. "You're a monster," she cried. "How could you do this to me?" I stayed calm, watching her meltdown with a sense of detachment. "Go sell yourself at those auctions you love so much," I said coldly. "I'm done." Without another word, I went to the bedroom, gathered her clothes, and tossed them out the window onto the front lawn. She stood frozen, her face a mixture of rage and disbelief. "Get out," I said firmly. "We're done here." She stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind her, leaving her phone on the kitchen counter in the chaos. Curiosity got the better of me. I picked up her phone and began scrolling through it, my suspicions growing with each passing moment. What I found confirmed every dark thought I'd had. Beyond the auctions, there were dozens of messages and photos documenting her affairs with wealthy businessmen. Some were tied to the auctions, while others were private rendezvous. It was worse than I imagined, a web of lies and betrayal stretching far beyond our home. Realizing the potential impact, I decided to leak the information anonymously. Just like with the video, I sent everything to multiple media outlets. The fallout was immediate. High-profile names were exposed, marriages were put under scrutiny, and the facade of respectability these men had built crumbled overnight. It wasn't about revenge anymore, it was about making sure they all felt the consequences of their actions. As the media storm raged on, I began to feel a strange sense of closure. My wife's life was in shambles. She had lost her job, her reputation, and now her marriage. Meanwhile, I started planning my next steps. The watch I had taken from the son of that older man was worth a fortune, and the cash from his jacket wasn't insignificant either. Together, it was enough to cover my legal fees and fund a fresh start. Sitting in the quiet of my now empty house, I couldn't help but reflect on everything that had happened. The betrayal, the lies, the chaos, it was all behind me now, or at least that's what I told myself. With the divorce papers filed and the media frenzy taking care of the rest, I was finally free to move on. But as I glanced at the watch on the table and thought about the storm I'd unleashed, one thing was clear: this wasn't the end of the story. Not yet. The divorce was finalized without any complications. Since my wife hadn't worked a single day during our marriage and the house and assets were in my name, she walked away with nothing. Legally and financially, it was as clean a break as I could have hoped for. The scandal surrounding her involvement in the auctions and affairs had left her reputation in ruins, closing any potential doors she might have turned to for support. Her world, once so glamorous, was now completely inaccessible to her. With the settlement behind me, I decided to start fresh. The watch I'd taken from that smug kid turned out to be worth a small fortune, and the cash I'd recovered was more than enough to cover the legal fees. I put the house up for sale and used the proceeds to fund my move to a quieter city closer to my parents. It was a deliberate decision, a way to distance myself from the chaos and start rebuilding my life in a place that felt more grounded. The process of selling the house and relocating wasn't without its challenges, but it was a relief to leave behind the memories of everything that had happened there. I bought a modest but comfortable home in my new city, one that felt like it belonged to a different chapter of my life. The first night there, sitting in the quiet, I finally felt a sense of peace that had been missing for far too long. A few weeks after the move, my ex-wife called me. Her tone was desperate, pleading for another chance. "We can fix this," she said. "I've changed. I'll do anything to make it right." I listened silently, letting her words hang in the air before ending the call without responding. There was nothing left to say. Her apologies couldn't erase what she had done, and I had no interest in reopening old wounds. Instead, I focused on securing my future. The money I had left after the move wasn't going to last forever, so I decided to be smart about it. I reached out to an investment analyst, someone who could help me turn my remaining funds into a reliable source of passive income. It was a practical step, but one that felt empowering. For the first time in years, I was making decisions purely for myself, without the weight of someone else's betrayal hanging over me. The investments began to pay off slowly but steadily, giving me a financial cushion that allowed me to breathe easier. It wasn't about becoming wealthy, it was about stability and the freedom to live on my own terms. I started spending more time with my parents, reconnecting with old friends, and rediscovering parts of myself that had been buried under years of stress and disappointment. As for the question that might be lingering in the minds of anyone following my story, why didn't I see it sooner? The answer is simple: I trusted her. That's what marriage is supposed to be, isn't it? A partnership built on trust. Looking back, there were signs, but I ignored them because I wanted to believe in what we had. It wasn't until the facade shattered completely that I could see things for what they were. Now, I live a quiet, stable life, far from the drama and deceit that once consumed me. Thanks to the investments and the careful planning I put into my new start, I don't have to worry about money or unexpected surprises. I've built a life that's entirely mine, free from the shadows of the past, and that's exactly how I intend to keep it.
I usually don't ask this early, but if you could like the video and subscribe, it would mean a lot. We're so close to hitting 1,000 subscribers, and your support can really help get my content out there. Thanks. My name is Marcus Schneider, 32, from Vienna, Austria. Growing up in a middle-class family with traditional values, I had always believed that loyalty, family, and hard work were the pillars of a good life. For the most part, my life had followed that path. I had a successful career as an architect, a loving wife, and a close-knit relationship with my brother, Stefan. Stefan and I were only 2 years apart, and we were inseparable. While I was more pragmatic and career-focused, Stefan was the adventurous one, always pushing me out of my comfort zone. Even when we grew older, that dynamic remained unchanged. He became a travel photographer, always jetting off to some new corner of the world, while I focused on building my architectural firm from the ground up. And then there was Emma. She was 29 when we met, a charismatic, charming woman who could light up any room. I was mesmerized by her confidence, her wit, and how easily she connected with people. We married 2 years after meeting, and I thought I had everything I could ever want. My professional life was flourishing, and with Emma by my side, I felt like I was on top of the world. We had dreams of traveling, building a family, and settling down in the countryside someday. But life doesn't always go according to plan. It was a sunny September morning when I got the call that would change my life forever. Stefan had been in a car accident while traveling through the mountains of Switzerland. It was a rainy night, and his car had skidded off the road. By the time emergency responders arrived, it was too late. He was gone. The grief hit me like a ton of bricks. Stefan had been my rock, my best friend, and my confidant. Without him, it felt like I had lost a part of myself. My world suddenly became darker, quieter. I withdrew from social gatherings, stopped attending work meetings, and spent hours in solitude. I expected Emma to understand. I needed her to. She had always been so supportive, or so I thought. In those early weeks of grief, I leaned on her, but something felt off. At first, I told myself that maybe she just didn't know how to deal with my loss, that she was giving me space. But soon, her behavior became more puzzling. She stopped coming home early from work. Her phone was constantly buzzing, and she would guard it with her life, taking it with her even when she showered. When I asked her about it, she brushed me off with vague excuses. "Just work," she would say, or "I'm planning something special for us." But deep down, I knew something was wrong. It had been 3 months since Stefan's death, and I was still struggling to get out of bed most mornings. I had returned to work on a limited basis, but I was far from being my usual self. One night, after Emma had come home late again, I decided to check her phone. I had never done anything like that before, but the sinking feeling in my gut wouldn't go away. As I scrolled through her messages, my hands trembled. I found what I had feared. A string of texts with a man named Tobias Mueller, someone she had mentioned in passing a few times. He was an old university friend, or so she had said. But these messages were far from friendly. They were intimate, flirtatious, and explicitly suggestive. It was clear from the timestamps that they had been talking for months, even before Stefan's death. I couldn't breathe. The realization that my wife had been cheating on me while I was mourning my brother was too much to bear. I confronted her the next morning, hoping against hope that she would deny it, that she would say it was all a misunderstanding. But when I showed her the messages, she didn't even flinch. "I can't do this anymore, Marcus," she said calmly, as if we were discussing the weather. "You've been so distant, so consumed by your grief. I felt like I was all alone in this marriage." I was speechless. She was blaming me, blaming my grief over losing my brother, for her betrayal. I had no words. I packed a bag and left the house that day, seeking refuge in my parents' home. I didn't know what else to do. The divorce process was swift but agonizing. Emma didn't fight for anything. She seemed eager to move on with her life, as if our marriage had been nothing more than a temporary inconvenience. She stayed in our apartment, and I found myself renting a small one-bedroom flat on the outskirts of Vienna. It was a far cry from the life we had planned together. I tried to throw myself into my work, but my heart wasn't in it. The firm had grown over the years, but without Stefan's adventurous spirit to keep me grounded, I felt lost. Friends and colleagues offered their support, but I kept my distance. I didn't want to burden them with my problems. My parents, too, were devastated. Stefan's death had been hard enough, but the collapse of my marriage only compounded the grief. They tried to be there for me, but I could tell they didn't know what to say. They were mourning the loss of a son and watching their other son unravel. Months passed, and slowly, I began to rebuild. I started running again, something Stefan and I used to do together. I reconnected with old friends, traveled to Italy and Greece, places Stefan had always talked about visiting. Bit by bit, I started to feel like myself again. I wasn't healed, but I was moving forward. Emma became a distant memory. I heard rumors that she was dating Tobias, but I didn't care to confirm them. She was no longer part of my life, and that was enough for me. 3 years later, just as I was starting to believe I had finally moved on, my phone buzzed with a message. It was from Emma. I hadn't heard from her since the divorce, and seeing her name on my screen sent a jolt through my body. My heart raced as I opened the message. "Marcus, we need to talk. There's something you should know." I stared at the screen, a knot forming in my stomach. What could she possibly want now? After all this time, what could she have to say? I debated ignoring the message, but my curiosity got the better of me. I responded with a simple, "What is it?" Her reply came almost immediately. "I have a son. He's 2 years old, and he's yours." I dropped the phone. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what she had just said. A son? How could that be? We had been divorced for 3 years, and if the child was 2, that meant she had conceived shortly after the divorce. But why was she only telling me now? I called her, my voice shaking as I demanded answers. She claimed that she hadn't known for sure if the child was mine until recently. "I didn't want to tell you until I was certain," she said, "but I had him tested. Marcus, he's yours." I didn't know what to believe. I demanded a paternity test, something official, not just her word. She agreed, albeit reluctantly, and we scheduled a test for the following week. The day of the test was surreal. I hadn't seen Emma in years, and she looked different, tired, worn down, almost desperate. She wasn't the confident, vibrant woman I had once married. Now she seemed fragile, like someone who had been through her own trials. We met at the clinic, and she had brought the boy with her. His name was Lucas, and he had big, bright eyes that reminded me of Stefan. The resemblance was uncanny, and for a moment, I wondered if maybe, just maybe, this child could be mine. But the timeline didn't make sense. I tried to suppress the hope that was bubbling inside me. The hope that I could have a son, that maybe my life could have some meaning again. I tried to focus on the facts. We did the test, and I left the clinic with a whirlwind of emotions swirling inside me. The results came in a week later. My hands shook as I opened the envelope, terrified of what I might find. But as I read the results, I felt a strange mix of relief and anger. The boy wasn't mine. The anger came swiftly after the relief. Emma had lied to me again, had tried to manipulate me into believing I was the father of her child. Why? Was it guilt? Desperation? I would never know. But I did know one thing. I was done with her for good. I met with her one last time, telling her that I knew the truth and that I never wanted to hear from her again. She didn't fight me on it. She looked defeated, her once lively spirit now hollow. As I walked away from that meeting, I knew that I was finally free. The years that followed were not without their challenges, but I had learned something valuable. Life is unpredictable, and people will betray you when you least expect it. But that doesn't mean you have to carry the weight of that betrayal forever. I started focusing on my own happiness, my work, my family, my friends. I met someone new, a woman named Sophia, and for the first time in years I felt hopeful about the future. She was kind, empathetic, and had a way of making me feel whole again. Looking back, I realized that losing Stefan, Emma, and my sense of stability all at once was one of the hardest things I had ever gone through. But it also taught me that I am resilient, that I can endure, and that I can find joy in life again. Thank you for watching my story of heartbreak, betrayal, and ultimate redemption. If you've ever experienced something similar, remember that healing takes time, but it is possible. Life moves forward, and so can you. Have any thoughts or questions about the story? Drop them in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more real-life stories. Let's keep the conversation going.
John Harkness valued honor, duty, and integrity. Growing up in a small town, he learned the importance of hard work while helping his father at the family auto repair shop. His father, a Korean War veteran, instilled in him a deep respect for service, which John carried throughout his life. After high school, John joined the Marines, quickly earning a reputation for toughness and leadership. John's life changed when he met Julie, a paralegal. They fell in love, married, and built a life based on love and trust. But when the Vietnam War started, John felt compelled to serve, despite being in the reserves. He volunteered for deployment, putting their plans to start a family on hold. Though Julie was supportive, it weighed heavily on both of them. Years later, John reflected on their 50-year journey together while getting a tattoo in her honor, only the second one of his life. As both a mechanic and a Marine, John excelled. He believed reservists like him should help carry the burden of the Vietnam War, even though they weren't being called up due to the high number of draftees. In March 1967, after 3 years of marriage and buying a house, he discussed his decision to volunteer with Julie, who worked at a local law firm. While it was tough, they were financially stable, and John assured her they'd be fine. Julie, though tearful, understood John's strong sense of duty. At 6'6", John was tough, but marriage had softened his rougher edges. The night before he left, they shared an emotional goodbye. "Come back to me safe and sound," Julie said, "and remember, you're mine." John laughed. "Don't worry, honey. I'll take care of myself. Just behave while I'm gone." With a smile, she replied, "I promise to be good." Before leaving for Vietnam, John updated his will and arranged for part of his $240.60 monthly salary as an E4 to go toward their mortgage. Half of his pay covered the house, and a quarter went into their joint account for utilities. John figured he wouldn't need much and hoped hazard pay would cover any extra expenses. He did, however, get one indulgence before leaving, a tattoo of a knife with the words, "Death before dishonor." He considered getting a rose with a name, but remembered his father's advice and decided against it. In Vietnam, John was assigned as a fire team commander in a Marine battalion. Although the regular Marines were initially skeptical of him as a reservist, he quickly earned their respect in battle. Unlike some soldiers, John avoided the local women, not only because he was happily married, but also due to fear of diseases. "Come on, man, it's Vietnam," Harker, a fellow corporal, teased him. John showed him a picture of Julie. "Not with her waiting for me," he replied. Harker laughed. "Beautiful, but you know Jody's already with her," referring to the slang for men who seduced military wives. John shook his head. "Not Julie, she'd never do that." As the weeks passed, John wrote to Julie often and cherished her letters, reading them over and over. Her letters, which had initially come every 2 weeks, became less frequent. John didn't worry at first, thinking the delays were due to their unit's movements, but it seemed strange that he heard from his parents more often than from her. One day, John received photos of Julie in a swimsuit, but he didn't recognize the swimsuit or know who took the pictures. He brushed it off, focusing on the war and his duties. When Christmas passed with no word from Julie, John grew worried but pushed the thoughts aside. By January 1968, his unit was near Da Nang, where rumors of a major enemy offensive for Tet circulated. At the end of the month, the enemy attacked early in the morning and John's position was overrun. Most of his team, including Harker, were eliminated, and John was seriously wounded. He was evacuated to a naval hospital in Da Nang, then transferred to San Francisco. Doctors saved his leg, and though the bullet missed his vital organs, he faced a long recovery. His ear was permanently damaged, and a scar would remain on his cheek. A Marine officer awarded him a Purple Heart and informed him he was recommended for the Silver Star, adding to his other honors. Sadly, the only surviving member of his crew, Jennings, died from his wounds. John's parents met him in San Francisco, but Julie wasn't there. When John asked about her, his father, after some hesitation, revealed that they hadn't seen her in weeks. His father shared that he had last seen Julie about 2.5 months earlier when he spotted a man leaving John's house in a sports car while Julie waved from the doorway in a robe. Since then, she hadn't returned calls or been home. His father apologized, saying he had been collecting the mail and newspapers in her absence. John was devastated. He had been sure of Julie's faithfulness, but now Harker's warnings about Jody made sense. He finally understood why she had gone silent. Was it a blue Corvette? John asked. Bob nodded. Yes, why? It belongs to Eric Swagman, a junior partner at her firm, John replied. So she's not even home to get the mail? Doesn't seem like it, Bob said. I noticed final notices for utilities in the phone, so I paid them. I figured you wouldn't want to come home to no power phone. Thanks, Dad, John said. I'll pay you back when I can. Don't worry about it. Focus on getting better. I can issue a power of attorney if you want. If she hasn't been paying bills, who knows what else she's done. Maybe even emptied your accounts. John called over a nurse to arrange a meeting with a military lawyer. A naval lieutenant commander soon arrived, took notes, and prepared the necessary documents. I'll handle the paperwork for you, Corporal, the officer said. Your parents will get power of attorney. I recommend contacting a family lawyer as soon as possible. We'll meet this afternoon to sign everything. Thank you, sir, John said. After the lawyer left, Bob reassured John. Once we're home, I'll check the bank and stop by the house. I still have the key you gave me. If you want, I can ask George Williams. He's retired and now does private investigations. He owes me a few favors. I don't know if I can afford a private investigator, Dad. Don't worry about that. George and I go way back. I can also talk to our family lawyer. Oh, by the way, Wilkins said your spot is still open at the workshop. He's been saving part of your salary as a bonus for your return. Just don't tell him I told you. John appreciated Wilkins' gesture. Though rarely showing his softer side, Wilkins was kind and generous beneath his gruff exterior, always honest and fair with customers. That sounds good, Dad, John said, wiping a tear. He silently cursed Julie. His parents hugged him. Everything will be fine, son, his mother reassured him. We'll handle it. A couple of hours later, the lawyer returned with a notary. After the documents were signed, John's parents left, promising to call with any updates. They thanked the nurse, who assured them John was in good hands and would soon be discharged to a VA hospital for physical therapy. Left alone, John finally slept. But his dreams weren't of Julie. He saw the Marines from his fire team, disfigured but sitting around a fire, talking as they used to. I'm sorry I couldn't bring you with me, John said. Harker smiled, lighting a cigarette. It's okay, Corporal. You did your best. Besides, there's no Charlie where we are now. Jennings nodded. Parker's right. I'm just surprised any of us made it out of there. Yeah, Johansson chimed in. It was only 10,000 of them against the 4 of us, right? Trujillo laughed. I think we took down about 9,000 of them. The others laughed, but Harker grew serious. You've got another battle ahead, brother. We all know it. And about Jody. Yeah, I was kidding back then. But you need to deal with him. The others grunted in agreement. We may not be with you in person, but we're with you in spirit, Johansson added. Thanks, guys, John said. See you, Harker replied with a smile. John woke up in a sweat. The dream felt so real, especially Harker's words. He knew someone would pay, but he needed more information first. A few days later, John got a call from his father. There's bad news, John, Bob said. Julie drained both your checking and savings accounts, leaving just $5. She also withdrew $8,545 from her own account 2 months ago, all in cash. The only money that came in was your military pay, which she withdrew after each payday. Okay, Dad, John replied. You have power of attorney. Take her name off the account. We don't have credit cards, so that's one less thing to worry about. I'll handle it. I also checked the house. It's a mess. Food is rotting, dishes are piled up, and it smells awful. She took everything except her wedding dress, our album, and her rings, which I found thrown in the bathroom trash. At least the house is still standing, John said. Yes, but the bed's filthy. I bet she brought her lover here. What do you want to do? Get rid of it, John said. "Break it down and toss it. I'll sleep on a cot if I have to." "Will do," Bob agreed. "By the way, George offered to help for free. He said nothing's worse than stealing a soldier's wife while he's at war. I also found a lawyer who will handle your divorce at no charge. He can't stand swagman. George suggests we change the locks, and I agree." "Yeah, go ahead with that," John said. "How are you holding up?" Bob asked. "I'm fine, really," John replied. "Who are you trying to convince, me or yourself?" Bob asked, knowing his son well. "Dad, you lost people in battle, right?" "Of course." John realized it was a foolish question. His father, a second lieutenant in the 1st Marine Regiment under Colonel Chesty Puller, had fought in the Battle of Chosin Reservoir in 1950. He knew all about combat, loss, and pass away. "Yes, son, I did," Bob replied. "Have you ever had dreams where they talk to you?" John asked. "Yeah, almost every night at first. They fade over time," Bob said. "Did you ever get over it?" "You never fully get over it. It becomes part of you. You learn to live with it or it will consume you," Bob answered. The next 2 weeks passed quickly for John. His parents called almost daily with updates on Julie. She had moved in with Eric Swagman and was pregnant by him. Their relationship was an open secret at work. John's lawyer, Mike McGregor, filed for divorce on grounds of infidelity and abandonment, along with a domestic violence suit against Eric. Mike also pursued legal action against Julie's employer for violating their moral code, and considered filing complaints with the state bar based on evidence George had gathered. Julie was furious when she found out she no longer had access to John's military paycheck account. She called John's parents in a rage, but they told her to ask Eric for money. She was also upset when her house keys didn't work, but they reminded her she no longer lived there. John found this amusing and focused on his physical and psychological therapy. Physically, John's wounds were healing, and he was learning to walk with a cane and crutch. Psychologically, he struggled with both the loss of his Marines and the betrayal by his wife. When his cast was removed, he asked the doctor about driving, and the doctor said he could, as long as it was an automatic. As John was wheeled back to his room, he noticed an orderly hanging up his uniform, now with sergeant's stripes. The doctor entered and explained, "You've been promoted, Sergeant, and you're discharged. You'll continue physical therapy at a VA near home, but don't put too much strain on your leg for now. Let's get you into your uniform, and we'll head to the break room." John found his freshly laundered uniform with corporal stripes still on it. After getting dressed, the nurse helped him with his boots, polished to a shine. Using a cane, John was led to his wheelchair and taken to the break room. To his surprise, his parents, doctors, nurses, and Lieutenant Colonel Arvin Johnson, his reserve battalion commander, were waiting. The colonel motioned for John to come forward. John surprised everyone by standing with his cane, and Lieutenant Colonel Johnson smiled, shaking his hand. He then read a promotion order, officially appointing John as a sergeant in the Marine Corps Reserves, adding, "And may God have mercy on your soul," which drew laughter. John's parents proudly removed his old stripes and attached the new ones. Then Lieutenant Colonel Johnson read another citation, presenting John with the Silver Star for his bravery during the Tet Offensive in Vietnam. On January 30th, 1968, Corporal Harkness had led his small team of Marines in battle against overwhelming enemy forces near Da Nang, continuing to fight despite being wounded and ordering his men to hold their ground. His leadership and courage had significantly contributed to the defense of Da Nang, earning him the Silver Star. Lieutenant Colonel Johnson placed the Silver Star medal on John's chest and shook his hand. "God bless you, son. Your experience will be valuable for training our men." John's mother hugged him, tears in her eyes. "I'm so proud of you," she said. Bob wiped away a tear and shook John's hand. "Me too." After packing his belongings into a sea bag, John changed into his Class C uniform, khaki shirt and green pants. Marines couldn't wear green uniforms off base. He met his parents, and they headed to the airport. When they arrived home, John no longer saw it as a true home since Julie's betrayal, but he appreciated the privacy. His parents stocked the fridge with beer and snacks, and his mom made his favorite dishes, including lasagna. John changed into jeans and a t-shirt, unpacking his things. At the bottom of his sea bag, he found something he'd nearly forgotten, a large Bowie knife he had discovered in Vietnam. The worn scabbard had a winged creature holding a sword, with faint words that looked like March au Crève. Though unsure of its origin, John valued it as a souvenir and planned to learn more about it. Later, he called his lawyer and George to arrange a meeting at his home. He rested and then decided to check on his prized pickup truck. It was still in the garage and appeared in good shape. After checking the fluids, he managed to start it with some effort and let it run smoothly. He planned to change the oil and give it a tune-up soon. After looking around his property, John grabbed a beer and sat in a rocking chair. His leg hurt, so he relaxed with the TV on for background noise. Not recognizing most of the shows, he settled on a game show. Then, he called Wilkins to let him know he was back. "About time," Wilkins barked. "When can you start?" John explained his situation with Julie and his physical therapy. "Take all the time you need, son. Just glad you're home. These guys could use your expertise. Stop by this week. I've got a small return gift for you." "I'll be there," John said before hanging up. Later, Mike and George arrived. John greeted them, offered beers, and they sat in the living room. "Good to see you, John," George said. "Congrats on your award. You deserve it. Now, let's get down to business." He pulled out a reel-to-reel recorder. "I've been watching Julie and Eric. One night I followed them to a steakhouse, got a seat near them, and recorded their conversation." George played the tape. Eric's voice came through first. "So, Julie, have you thought about my proposal?" "I don't know, Eric. It's bad enough I cheated on John and am pregnant with your child. I just don't think I can convince him." "Come on, baby. If anyone can, it's you. He's probably desperate right now, willing to do anything to bring you home," Eric replied smugly. "You don't know John. He'll never agree to raise this child or share me with you," Julie said. "No, we won't let him touch you. Look, I'm not cut out to be a dad. John would do a better job raising the kid. If he doesn't agree, we'll threaten him with divorce, take his house, half his income, and demand alimony and child support. I already have the documents ready," Eric said. George paused the tape. "They seriously think you'd let that happen?" John asked, shocked. "There's more," George said, restarting the tape. "I don't know, Eric. John won't go for this," Julie said again. "He's so in love with you, he'll do anything," Eric said. "Unless you still have feelings for him?" "I do, but not like before. Besides, you're better in bed," Julie replied. John blushed, feeling bitter about loving such a two-faced woman. "I wouldn't have left you for Vietnam. What kind of fool does that?" Eric sneered. John felt the urge to punch something. "You're right," Julie agreed. "I'll talk to him when he gets back." "Good. Do you know when that will be?" Eric asked. "No, I haven't heard from him since January, and I haven't sent him anything since last year like you suggested," Julie said. "If he's stubborn, we have other ways to push him," Eric hinted. "Like what?" Julie asked. "Houses can burn down, brakes can fail," Eric said. "You're not planning to hurt him, are you?" Julie asked, worried. "I won't support that." "Don't worry, you won't be involved. If something happens, you get everything and you're free," Eric said. "Only as a last resort," Julie agreed. "Exactly. We'll see when he gets back," Eric replied. George turned off the tape. "That's a conspiracy to commit liquidation," John said. George and Mike agreed, adding that it could also be conspiracy to commit fraud and theft, since Julie drained John's accounts. "I filed court papers on my way here and expedited the hearing. There's also a protective order keeping them 100 feet away from you, your house, and your parents," Mike explained. "I talked to the district attorney, and they're preparing a criminal case. I also spoke with a senior partner at their firm, who's outraged. We're filing a lawsuit against the firm for violating its moral code. By the end, Swagman might end up in jail. Your father and I have friends in the department, including the chief," George added. "They'll keep an eye on you." "Any questions?" George asked. "Yes," John replied. "What should I ask for in the divorce?" Mike handed John a folder. "Your dad acted on your behalf," he said. "We're filing for divorce on grounds of infidelity and abandonment. Since she earns more than you, there's no alimony. You keep the house and everything in it because she left and didn't pay the bills. We're also demanding $7,100 from her to cover half of the joint expenses, plus the return of her rings and a name change back to her maiden name. She keeps her clothes and car. We're suing Swagman for $800,000 and the firm for $2 million for not following their moral code. The firm might settle for half to avoid bad press." Mike added, "One more thing. Do you have a dress uniform?" "Yes," John replied. "Good. Get it dry cleaned and attach your medals. I want you to wear it in court so everyone sees who Julie and Eric betrayed. I have a surprise for them, but I'll reveal it later. Just let me know when," John said. "Will do. Now I've got dinner waiting at home. Get some rest," Mike said. "I think I'll go grab a beer and see if I run into any old friends," John replied. "Be careful," George warned. "This place has gotten a bit rougher." "Not more than Da Nang," John said. and they all laughed. Not quite, George chuckled, but close. After George and Mike left, John went to his bedroom and changed shirts. He thought about the knife, grabbed it, and hoped to meet a friend who was knowledgeable about knives. He locked the house, walked to the garage, and started his truck. Damn, this feels good, he thought as the truck roared to life. He pulled out and headed to one of his old spots, stopping for gas on the way. He parked in front of the bar like usual and looked around. George was right. The area had become a bit more dangerous since he was last there. Damn, he thought, I've seen worse. He walked into the bar through a cloud of cigarette smoke. After grabbing a beer, he looked around, searching for familiar faces, but saw no one. The place where regulars like him once hung out for a chat over beer now seemed like a gathering spot for gangsters. He finished his beer and headed back to his truck. As he passed an alley, he thought he heard a woman screaming for help. He stopped and listened. The scream echoed through the alley. "Please stop!" a woman's voice cried. He heard laughter and swearing. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he spotted the source of the sounds. A young woman was surrounded by 5 or 6 skinny men. From where he stood, he could tell they would hurt her if no one stepped in. John reached into his truck and grabbed a tool for protection. He slid it into the back of his belt and crept toward the woman, leaving his cane behind, knowing he'd need both hands. As he got closer, he saw one of the men grab the woman's dress and tear it, exposing her body as she screamed. It was time to act. "Hey!" John shouted. "Leave the woman alone. Didn't you hear her? She said stop!" The men froze and stared at John, unsure of what to make of the scarred white guy standing in their alley. One of them cautiously approached. "Or what?" he asked, pulling out a switchblade and flicking it open, assuming John would back down. John smiled and laughed. He reached back and pulled out his own knife, and the smaller man's eyes widened in fear. "You really want to do this?" he asked firmly, trying to defuse the situation. The man twisted his knife and tried to move around John, positioning himself between John and his buddies. John saw through the maneuver and countered, preventing the man from carrying out his plan. The gangster charged with his knife. John dodged, grabbed the man's wrist, and with a swift move, the knife fell from his hand as he cried out in pain. John quickly reacted, dodging the incoming attack, and with a swift movement, managed to disarm the man, sending him stumbling to the ground. The rest of the group, confused and shaken, began to back away. They'd never seen a knife that size, and they definitely hadn't seen anyone take down their friend like that, especially not a white guy. Most of them scattered, but 2 stayed behind to face John. Unfortunately, John didn't see or hear the man coming up from behind with a large wooden board, a nail sticking out of it. "Look out behind you!" the woman screamed. John turned just in time to see the board swing toward him, and everything went black as it punched the side of his head. He collapsed, bracing for another shot, but the man dropped the weapon and fled as red and blue lights flashed at the alley's entrance. John sat up slowly as a cop approached him. "Damn it, Harkness," the cop said. "Didn't George warn you this was a rough area?" "Yeah," John muttered, holding his head. "I guess I'm too stubborn to listen." The cop surveyed the scene and told his partner to call for a couple of ambulances. He grabbed 2 more pairs of handcuffs, went over to the men lying on the ground and cuffed them. Returning to John, he spotted the large knife beside him. "Now that's a knife," the officer said, picking it up. "Where'd you get this?" "I picked it up in Vietnam," John replied. "Hand it over," the officer said. "Got a case for it?" John pulled out the leather sheath and handed it to him. The officer examined it closely. "Foreign Legion. Seriously?" he asked. "Marines," John said. "Just got back." "I know you were in the Marines, John. I'm talking about the markings on the sheath. That symbol means French Foreign Legion, and the words under it mean march or die. This isn't standard issue. I bet it belonged to a French soldier once." He handed the knife back to John. "Better store this somewhere safe before a tough cop confiscates it. Maybe hang it up in a frame." John nodded. "Yeah, I'll do that." The woman, visibly shaken, approached the officer. "Please don't arrest him, officer," she said. "He saved my life. Those men were going to hurt me." The officer looked at her torn dress. "It's all right, ma'am. He's not under arrest, but he'll need to see a doctor, and we'll need your statement. I'll take him to the ER in my car and give my statement there. Is that okay?" she asked. The cop thought for a moment and then agreed. "All right, miss. You can follow me to the hospital," he said, calling over to his partner, who approached quickly. Another officer glanced at the handcuffed men on the ground and whistled. "Damn," he said. "Isn't this Juan Mendoza, the gang leader we've been hearing about?" The first cop nodded. "Yeah, that's him." And this guy took out all 3 of them? The second cop asked. The first cop nodded again. Seems like it, he replied. Damn, the second cop muttered. By then, 2 ambulances had arrived, and the paramedics were loading the gang members onto stretchers. The first cop helped John to his feet. You didn't get enough of this stuff in Vietnam? He asked with a grin. John laughed, though it hurt. Apparently not, he said. All I wanted was to have a beer with my friends. Well, this young lady will take you to the ER. Hand over your keys. My partner will drive your truck home, and I'll pick him up after we're done at the hospital, the cop said, pointing at John. And stay away from this place. It's not what it used to be. The regulars hang out at Rockwood on the other side of town now. Thanks, officer. I'll keep that in mind, John said. He followed the young woman, who introduced herself as Amelia Simmons, to her small Dodge Dart. Aren't you the guy who earned the Silver Star in Vietnam? She asked on the way to the hospital. Yeah, he replied. How do you know about that? Who doesn't? It was all over the news today, she said. But what are you doing here? Shouldn't you be home with your wife or something? John couldn't hold back and started crying quietly. He didn't know what hurt more, Julie's betrayal or the fact that strangers seemed to care more about him than his own wife. Sorry, Amelia said. I didn't mean to upset you. What happened? John gave her the short version of his marriage ending, and she began to cry too. She pulled into the ER parking lot, found a space, and hugged him. That's awful, she said. That woman doesn't deserve you. Tears streamed down her face. John looked at her and asked, Why are you crying? Those men were going to hurt or even eliminate me. But you stepped in when you could have died. You don't even know me, yet you were willing to risk your life for me, she cried. I can never repay you for that. John hugged her back. You don't owe me anything, he said. No, I do. I owe you everything. You saved my life even when you were already hurting. So I'll do the same for you. No matter how long it takes, I'll help heal your broken heart, she said. I promise, no one will hurt you again. Not like she did. You don't even know me, John said. And you didn't know me either, she replied. But after tonight, I know all I need to. John Harkness, you're my hero, my knight in shining armor. I want to take care of you, hold you, and fill the emptiness in your heart. Please let me. John considered her words. He looked into her eyes and saw only love, no deceit. There was a beauty in her he couldn't quite describe, perhaps because of all the pain from Julie. In the back of his mind, he heard Harker's voice. Come on, Corporal. Sorry, Sergeant. John smiled, though Amelia didn't know why. Okay, he said, kissing her gently. She hugged him tightly. You won't regret this, John, I promise, she said. They entered the emergency room where the officer was waiting while the doctor examined John and Amelia. The doctor cleaned John's cheek wound and took x-rays. After reviewing the images, he looked at John. You must have a jaw made of steel, the doctor said. Amelia was fine as well. John gave his statement about the evening's events, and the officer seemed satisfied. John, the cop said, Amelia's a good girl, but she's had it rough. Her parents died in a car crash a few years back, and she's been on her own since. Her last boyfriend was abusive. She finally left him, but now she's homeless and has been living in her car for 3 days. I know you've got your own problems, but maybe you could help her out. Heck, maybe you both can help each other. Thanks, John said. Maybe you're right. John was taken aback by what the officer said. Amelia hadn't mentioned any of her struggles, yet she had been there comforting him. He felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Love, maybe. Whatever it was definitely better than anything Julie had given him. The officer handed him a card. Call me if you need anything, he said before walking over to Amelia. Follow me to John's house. I need to pick up my partner anyway, he said. She thanked him, and they left the ER. They drove to John's house in silence. John had a lot on his mind. His soon-to-be ex-wife had treated him like dirt. His fellow Marines were gone. And now there was Amelia. John didn't believe in coincidences, but he couldn't help but wonder. Both of them were in pain, but each had set their pain aside to help and comfort the other. They finally arrived at John's house, and after the officers left, he invited her inside. It's okay, Amelia, I don't bite. It's way more comfortable here than in your car, he said. I don't want to impose, she replied. John grabbed one of her bags from the car. Nonsense, he said. It's no imposition. I've got a spare room, and it's a lot safer than sleeping in your car at a rest stop. Okay, she said. You're probably right. Once Amelia's things were set up in the guest room, John invited her into the living room and offered her a cup of coffee. She accepted and settled on the couch. While making coffee for both of them, they swapped stories. John told Amelia about his marriage and time in Vietnam, and Amelia shared her life story. John learned that her parents were hardworking but had struggled financially. They died in a car accident while they were living in an apartment, leaving Amelia with nothing. She sold what little she had but ended up on the streets. The small savings her parents left behind went toward their final expenses. After losing her job as a secretary when her boss moved, she found work as a waitress at a diner near the alley where she was attacked. She earned just enough to share an apartment with a friend, but when her friend moved to another state, Amelia couldn't afford the rent alone. She dated a man briefly, but he became violent when she refused his advances. So she left and returned to sleeping in her car, hoping to save enough to rent a room. "Why don't you stay here?" John asked. "I can't take advantage of your kindness like that," she said. "I can't pay you anything, and it won't look good with your divorce going on." "It's no problem," John said. "You can stay in the spare room and maybe help me keep the place in order. As for the divorce, if anyone asks, I'll just say you were homeless, and I let you stay in exchange for help around the house." "That sounds fair," Amelia said. "I hope you don't get tired of me." John laughed. "I doubt it," he said. "I hope you can stand looking at this ugly face," he added, pointing to his scar. She gently ran her fingers over his scar and ear. "I can handle it," she said. "Actually, I think it makes you look tough, like someone who doesn't take crap from anyone," John chuckled. "Flattery will get you far. By the way, things might get a little hectic here for the next couple of days," he said. "Julie and her lover are getting their papers tomorrow morning, so I expect the phone will start ringing around 9 a.m. I also have some errands. Want to join me?" "Of course," she said. "I've got a few days off." "Well, I don't know about you, but I'm exhausted, and my leg is starting to hurt. I'm heading to bed," John said. "I'll come with you if that's all right," she said, following him down the hallway. "Do you mind if I sleep with you tonight?" "No, Zex. I just need someone to hold me." "Of course," he replied. "I promise to behave." She smiled and went to the bathroom to shower and change, while John got ready for bed. He was already under the covers when she returned, wearing a long t-shirt and underwear. She slid under the blanket and he instinctively wrapped his arms around her. She placed her hand on his chest and rested her head on his shoulder. She feels so good, John thought. They fell asleep and woke up the next morning with John still holding Amelia, his hand on her bare bosom. He quickly pulled away, startling her. "Sorry," he said. Amelia smiled. They showered and got ready for the day. While Amelia prepared breakfast, John got dressed. At 9:20 a.m., the phone rang. "What the hell is this, John?" Julie yelled. "I don't want a divorce. And what's all this about cheating and abandonment? I don't care what you want now." "Julie," John replied, "you moved out, refused to pay the bills, stole thousands, slept with Eric Swagman, moved in with him, and now you're pregnant with his baby or someone else's. That clear things up?" "I didn't know you were back, John, or I would have come to you," she said. "Nonsense, Julie. It was all over the news. People I don't even know welcome me home. But not you. You were too busy cheating with your boyfriend to care about your husband," he said. "You don't understand, John. I still love you," she cried. "No, you don't, Julie. I haven't heard from you since last year. I found out everything from my parents when they visited me in the hospital after I got shot. You didn't even send me a card. How can you claim you love me when you're carrying someone else's child?" "But I love you, John," she insisted. "No, you don't, Julie," he said sharply. "What did you tell him when you talked about me raising your fool?" "How do you know what I said?" she asked, crying. He had never spoken to her like this before. "Do you really mean it? Just sign the damn papers and get it over with. We're done. And I'll take your boyfriend down with you." Suddenly, Eric picked up the phone. "Listen, a-hole, I'll bury you," he threatened. "I don't think so, idiot. Tougher men than you have tried and ended up 6 feet under. You want to go up against me? I'll bury you, and you'll be begging for mercy. I heard you planning to torch my house and mess with my truck. Try it, and I promise you, you'll regret it. You'll be lucky not to end up in prison," John replied. "We'll see," Eric shot back. Julie got back on the phone. "John, please, let's talk this through. There's no need for a divorce. Eric and I have a proposal for you," she said. "If you want to talk to my lawyer," John responded. "Here's my proposal. Go to hell and die." He hung up and punched the wall. "Damn her," he yelled. Amelia came up and hugged him. "It's okay, John. She had it coming. They both did. Let your lawyer handle this. That's why you pay him. Calm down, please," she said. "How can she say she loves me after everything she's done?" John asked. "I don't know, John," Amelia replied. It's obvious she's not in her right mind. Come on, didn't you say we had things to do today? Let's get going. You're right, he said. What's first on the list? She asked. I need to visit my civilian boss, get my dress uniform dry cleaned, and have the medals pinned on it. Then, buy parts for the truck and do some maintenance, he replied. Let's get to it, she said. We've got a busy day. But first, I'll call my lawyer, John added. Amelia agreed, and John made the call, telling Mike about Julie's earlier call. Yeah, I figured she'd lose it, Mike said. And Swagman looked ready to break something. I'll be curious to see what they come up with. By the way, I talked to Lee. He's meeting with the senior partners and board this afternoon. Also, make sure your dress uniform is ready. Trial's next Friday. Got it. Thanks, Mike, John said. I'm taking care of it today. I'll call if anything else comes up. They left the house and dropped off John's uniform and medals at the cleaners, giving detailed instructions on how to handle them. The owner, an old military vet, knew exactly how to do it right. Then they headed to old Wilkins's shop. Hey, boss, John said as he and Amelia walked in. Wilkins glanced up from a stack of papers. Well, look who it is, Wilkins said. Damn, I need a secretary. I don't have time for all this paperwork. I've got cars to fix. John glanced at Amelia. Seriously, you need a secretary? Hell yeah, Wilkins said. I've got paperwork, phones to answer, and customers to deal with. I know someone who was a secretary and might be looking for a better job. Interested? John asked. Hell yes, Wilkins said. John took Amelia's hand. Boss, meet my friend, Amelia Simmons. She was a secretary, John said. Wilkins looked her over. Think you can handle all this, young lady? He asked. Amelia nodded. Absolutely. I can type 50 words a minute, sort documents, take shorthand, work with customers, and even run the cash register. Wilkins considered her for a moment. Are you working now? He asked. Yes, but I'm a waitress and not making much, she said. Here's what I'll do. Give your boss 2 weeks' notice, then come work for me. I'll start you at $125 a week since you're John's friend. How's that sound? Wilkins offered. That sounds great. Thank you, Mr. Wilkins, she said, smiling. You know anything about cars? He asked. Not as much as you, but my dad taught me a lot, she replied. Even better, Wilkins said. Oh, John, I've got something for you, Wilkins said, pulling out an envelope from his desk and handing it to John. Consider it a welcome home bonus. John opened the envelope to find a check for $2,340. He shook Wilkins' hand. Thanks, boss. This means a lot. You've earned it. Deal with your cheating wife, then get back to work, Wilkins said, grinning. It's on my list, boss, John replied with a smile. Wilkins waved them off. You guys go. As they left the shop, Amelia looked at John in amazement. Wow, $125 a week? I've never made that much. Thanks again, John. You're welcome, John replied. Did you know that's almost double what I make as a sergeant in the Corps? Really? Amelia asked, surprised. Oh yeah, John said. So you really know about cars? Yes, my dad taught me how to tune cars, change belts and tires, and do oil changes. We didn't have much, so he fixed everything himself, she said. Don't tell Wilkins that. He'll have you under every car in the shop, John joked. Amelia laughed. I wouldn't mind getting some grease under my nails. You take care of the truck and I'll show you what I can do, she said, giving him a wink. John grinned. Damn, girl, I think I'm in love. Amelia giggled and kissed him on the cheek. Me too, she whispered. They stopped at John's bank, where he deposited the check and set aside 10% for savings as usual. He kept $100 in cash and ordered new checks, without Julie's name on them. Then, they went to the auto parts store to pick up everything John needed for the truck. After grabbing burgers, they headed home. Home, John thought. With Amelia by his side, it really felt like home. He parked the truck in the garage and started prepping for work while Amelia changed clothes. When she returned, she wore old jeans and a t-shirt. So, what's the plan? John asked. Amelia grabbed the spark plugs and wires. I'll do the spark plugs and wires while you handle the oil, she said confidently. Okay, John said, surprised. You know how to check the spark plug gaps? You're kidding, right? She replied, gathering the tools and getting to work. John was amazed at how smoothly she handled the tools. He worked on the oil change while she replaced the plugs, wires, rotor, and distributor cap. When he finished, he inspected her work, genuinely impressed. Everything looked perfect. Still, John knew looks could be deceiving, so he lowered the truck, climbed in, and started the engine. It hummed smoothly, just as he'd hoped. He revved the engine, listening for any issues, but there were none. Satisfied, he turned off the engine and looked at Amelia, now with oil smudges on her hands and face. In that moment, she looked more beautiful to him than Julie ever had. "Well?" she asked, a bit unsure. John took her face in his dirty hands and kissed her on the lips. "Now I know for sure I'm in love," he said. "You're hired." Amelia smiled, not caring that her face was even dirtier now. John handed her some hand cleaner. There had been a time when he wished Julie would share moments like this, but she always found his work too dirty. After cleaning up, Amelia cooked dinner, and they spent a quiet evening watching TV. For the first time in a long while, John felt content and didn't think about his soon-to-be ex-wife. The next few days passed quickly. John picked up his uniform from the dry cleaners and spent hours removing loose threads, polishing his boots, and shining his cap visor. Amelia handed in her resignation at the diner, only to be told she was fired on the spot. She left, knowing she'd have to return for her final paycheck in a few days. As the days went by, John and Amelia grew closer. They both agreed to wait until John's divorce was finalized before deepening their relationship. John found this difficult. It had been a long time since he'd been with a woman, but he was falling in love with Amelia and knew she felt the same. Finally, the day of the court hearing arrived. After breakfast, John showered, shaved, and dressed, then walked into the living room where Amelia was waiting in a beautiful dress. "Wow," she said, admiring him in his full dress uniform with his medals. "You look like you're ready to be devoured." John smiled. "Thanks, but I feel like a Christmas tree." "You look amazing too," he added. At the courthouse, they were greeted by 14 uniformed Marines from John's unit, including Lieutenant Colonel Johnson and Sergeant Major Roberts. After introductions, they went inside, where the Marines filled 2 rows of the courtroom. John joined his lawyer, Mike, at the table while his parents sat with the Marines. John glanced over at Julie and Eric at the other table. Julie's eyes widened at the sight of the man she had betrayed, while Eric smirked, resting his hand on Julie's pregnant belly. Julie hadn't noticed Amelia yet. The judge entered, and the bailiff instructed everyone to stand. Once seated, the judge noticed the Marines and asked, "What brings you here today, gentlemen?" Lieutenant Colonel Johnson stood. "Your Honor, we're here to support Sergeant Harkness and, if necessary, testify to his character." The judge nodded with a smile. "Thank you, Colonel. I don't think it'll be needed, but I appreciate the gesture." The Marines remained silent, glaring at Julie and Eric throughout the proceedings. As Mike predicted, the case went smoothly. The judge questioned both John and Julie about their marriage and the circumstances leading to the divorce. Julie admitted to leaving John, not paying bills, and becoming pregnant by Eric Swagman, who absurdly demanded child support from John. "Do you seriously expect me to order Mr. Harkness to pay child support for a child you fathered?" the judge asked incredulously. "Are you serious or just stupid?" Denied. Every request Swagman made was denied. In the end, the judge ruled in John's favor, granting him the house, issuing a permanent restraining order, denying child support, and ordering Julie to return half of the money she withdrew from their joint account. She was also instructed to revert to her maiden name. There was no need to return the wedding rings, as Julie had already discarded them. Swagman tried to object, but the judge silenced him with a sharp rap of the gavel. "And as for you, Mr. Swagman," the judge added, pointing with his gavel, "I'm ordering an investigation into your role in all this. At a minimum, there's a serious conflict of interest here, and the district attorney is considering other charges, including conspiracy." Swagman's face reddened as the judge continued. "Your actions today will weigh heavily on any future proceedings. Mr. Harkness's divorce is granted." Swagman jumped up in a rage. "You fool! I'll have your ex and any other woman you're with, and I'll bury you." John stayed calm. "I don't think so," he replied quietly. Swagman looked around, his anger meeting the stern gazes of the Marines and John's steady indifference. Julie avoided his eyes, her head hung in shame. Before Swagman could say another word, the bailiff stepped in, placing a firm hand on his shoulder and guiding him back to his seat. John shook his head, as Swagman sat defeated. Lee Marcus, who had been watching from the back of the courtroom, approached. "You're fired," he told Swagman bluntly. "I'm also filing a formal complaint with the bar. Pack your things and leave by the end of the day." Swagman clenched his fists, but said nothing as Lee turned to Julie. "Julie, you're still employed, at least until you have the baby and recover. After that, we'll reevaluate your position." Julie nodded silently as Lee turned to John. "Sergeant, thank you for your service," Lee said, shaking John's hand. "On behalf of the firm and our board, I apologize for everything you've gone through." John nodded, his gaze still fixed on Julie. Lee then addressed Mike. Given the situation and John's service, the board finds your original proposal acceptable. No need to prolong this or waste any more money. Let's finalize the details next week. Mike nodded. Thanks, Lee. I'll call you Monday. As Lee left, John turned to Amelia, who had quietly observed everything. She embraced him tightly, and he took comfort in her presence. When they parted, John noticed Julie watching, tears in her eyes. "John, I'm so sorry," Julie said, her voice shaking. "I didn't mean to hurt you." John's response was cold. "Well, you did." Julie wiped her eyes. "Why did it have to come to this?" "You weren't there, Julie. Eric was. You saw dollar signs and made your choices. Now you live with them," John said. Julie's voice was barely audible. "What's this about you raising my baby?" John's eyes narrowed. "Eric thought I'd raise your child while you stayed with him. It's ridiculous." "I didn't like the idea, but I considered it," Julie admitted. "I'm sorry." John just shook his head. Julie glanced at Amelia, realizing who she was. "I see you've moved on," she said bitterly. Amelia stepped forward. "I'm not just replacing you. I'm here to heal the heart you broke, and I intend to do that for the rest of my life." Julie looked down. "I guess I deserve that." John, his tone softer but still hurt, asked, "Can we ever be friends, Julie?" "I don't know. I don't deserve your forgiveness," she replied, eyes filled with regret. John sighed. "It'll take time. If it weren't for Amelia and my parents, I don't think I'd be here." Tears streamed down Julie's face as she left. John felt both sadness and relief as he watched her go. Turning to Mike, he shook his hand. "Thanks for everything, Mike. I owe you." Mike waved it off. "That's what friends are for. Besides, knocking Swagman down a peg was satisfying. Now go celebrate. You've earned it." After shaking hands with the Marines, John and Amelia left the courthouse. His parents were waiting, and his mother hugged him. "We're so proud of you, son," she said, then turned to Amelia. "Who's this lovely young lady?" John introduced Amelia, and his parents warmly welcomed her, inviting her to dinner. "We want to know the woman who makes our son so happy," his mother said. "I'd love that," Amelia replied. The following weeks were a turning point for John. His divorce finalized, he was free to move forward. He and Amelia grew closer, and one evening, after receiving the final decree, John proposed. Amelia said yes, and they were married soon after in a Marine sword ceremony. They continued working at Wilkins' shop, though they didn't need the money. When Wilkins passed away in 1980, he left the shop to John. John remained in the Marine Reserves, retiring as a staff sergeant in 1992, a year after returning from Operation Desert Storm. Though he still dreamed of his Vietnam comrades, John learned to cope, just like his father had. He and Amelia ran the shop until their retirement in 2008, passing it to their two sons. Life was peaceful until one evening, years later, when John spotted a tattoo design in a parlor window. It was a rose, similar to one he had seen in Vietnam, with space for a name. On a whim, John led Amelia into the shop. "What are you doing?" she asked. "I almost got this tattoo with Julie's name back in Vietnam. Now I want yours above my heart where it belongs," John said. Amelia's eyes filled with tears. "But why?" "Because you healed my heart, and I want the world to know how much I love you," John replied. The tattoo artist looked at John skeptically. "You sure, old man?" John chuckled, taking off his shirt. "Absolutely." Amelia, still holding his hand, asked, "Won't it hurt?" "Yeah, like hell," John grinned, "but it'll be worth it." As the needle buzzed to life, John smiled, knowing the pain was nothing compared to the love he'd found. I never imagined how my life would take such a sharp turn when I was a boy, standing knee-deep in the fields behind our modest home. My father always said that hard work was the cornerstone of a good life, and back then, I believed him. Those early years were filled with the smell of fresh soil, the hum of cicadas in the summer, and the comforting rhythm of small-town simplicity. But life isn't kind to naivety. My older brother James was the family's golden child. He was the one everyone admired. The athlete, the charmer, the ambitious one. I, on the other hand, was the boy who spent hours in the shed tinkering with old tools and dreaming of machines that could make life easier for people like us. James would scoff at my ideas, calling them childish. But I was too stubborn to care. Our family business, Miller's Incorporated, was a modest tool manufacturing company started by my grandfather. From the moment I could hold a wrench, I was a part of it. By the time I hit my 20s, I'd developed my first invention, a revolutionary drilling mechanism. My patents became the backbone of the company's success, though my contributions were often overshadowed by James's charm and my parents' favoritism toward him. Then came Catherine. She was a whirlwind, beautiful, confident, and utterly captivating. At first, I couldn't believe someone like her would look twice at a guy like me. When we married, I thought I had it all: a loving wife, a thriving career, and 2 wonderful kids. But beneath the surface, fractures were forming. James had always been competitive, but when he began worming his way into Catherine's life, I didn't see the warning signs. The betrayal, when it came, was shattering. It wasn't just the affair, it was the cold calculation of their actions. James had not only stolen my wife, but maneuvered to seize control of the business I had worked so hard to build. The day I discovered them together was the day I lost everything. My parents, always quick to side with James, dismissed my anger as irrational. They told me to let it go, to focus on the big picture. But how could I, when my world had been ripped apart? So I walked away, from Catherine, from the family, from the life I thought I was building. Rebuilding was slow and grueling. I started small, using the royalties from my patents to fund a humble garage where I could work on new projects. It was there, surrounded by tools and grease-streaked walls, that I found the beginnings of peace. And when Marina came into my life, her strength and unwavering support became the foundation for a new kind of happiness. I had grease up to my elbows, the engine of my car demanding all my focus, when the echo of sharp, deliberate footsteps interrupted my thoughts. The distinct scent of a perfume I hadn't smelled in years wafted in before I heard her voice. "You're certainly hard to track down." Catherine's tone carried a practiced nonchalance. Though I could feel the tension behind her words, I didn't bother looking up. "Maybe that's a you problem," I muttered, keeping my focus on the engine. She huffed and strolled around the garage, her heels echoing. "So, this is your life now?" I glanced at the cluttered bench and oil-streaked floor. "What'd you expect? A penthouse and a valet?" I slammed the hood shut, wiped my hands on a rag, and poured coffee into 2 plastic mugs. Handing her one, I added, "I'm no fan of yours, but my mama taught me manners." She took the cup gingerly, her expression unreadable. "I was hoping we could talk. Me, you, and James." That stopped me cold. I stared at her. "You think I'd sit down with that snake?" She sighed. "We could have had a civilized conversation, sorted things out." I laughed bitterly. "Civilized? He'd need my boots surgically removed first." She rolled her eyes. "You know what he is. We both need to move on." "Move on?" I shot back. "He seduced my wife, stole my company, and left me with nothing. Now you want me to play nice?" Her face tightened, but she pressed on. "Why stoop to his level if you don't have to?" I smirked. "Funny coming from you. You seemed fine rolling in the mud with him." Her face went pale. "You knew?" I nodded, sipping my coffee. "Yep. What'd you think? That I'd just miss you sneaking around?" She fidgeted with her skirt, avoiding my gaze. "I didn't come here to fight," she murmured. "You just disappeared. No note, no explanation." Leaning back against the car, I crossed my arms. What was there to explain? I left with what little I had and started over. A note wouldn't have changed anything. She opened her mouth, but I cut her off. Actually, I thought about leaving one. "Dear Catherine, you're a cheating liar. Have a terrible life. Bye." But even that seemed like a waste of paper. Her face twisted with anger. "I was never a thief," I barked a laugh. "But you didn't deny the rest." Her silence was all the confirmation I needed. "While I was out drowning my sorrows after James stole my company, you were celebrating with him, in my bed." She flinched, but I didn't stop. The memory burned too hot. I pressed on, my voice sharp. "When I caught you two, a better man might have thrown punches, maybe called the cops. But me? I just stood there like the ground had vanished beneath me. The rage, bitter, searing, fought against this crushing defeat." My tone steadied, quieter but no less cutting. "So I walked away. 2 graves and a life sentence weren't worth it. You weren't worth it." She swallowed hard, her voice barely above a whisper. "Andrew," I didn't let her finish. "Yeah?" I shot back, my anger rising again. Then why do you and that snake of a brother own the business I built with my blood, sweat, and tears? Her face reddened. I wasn't part of that. It was your parents, Andrew. They said it was best for the company. I let out a bitter laugh. Best for business? No, it was best for their golden boy, your lover. They knew and they didn't care. Hell, they closed ranks around him while I got shoved aside. She straightened, her posture stiff as she tried to regain control. I didn't come here to rehash the past, she said, her voice clipped. I crossed my arms, keeping my tone calm but cold. No? Then why bring it all up, stirring the pot like I owe you something? You don't get to show up here and drag all that back like nothing happened. So, if this isn't about the past, what do you want? Her expression didn't waver, her tone deliberately casual. It's about Logan and Maria. My jaw tightened. What about them? I asked evenly. They miss you. Her voice softened, though she still held her ground. Your kids miss you. They know where to find me, I replied. Her glance around the garage told me that wasn't an option she liked. They need more stability, she pressed, rehearsed now. If you can't give them the life they deserve, we need to find another way. I raised an eyebrow. And what's this other way? She hesitated, then rushed out. We were thinking James could adopt them. I froze. What? He's there for them every day. Together, he and I provide what they need, she said, like she was explaining something obvious. This is about the kids, not us. I just want what's best for them. I leaned back against the workbench, narrowing my eyes as I fixed her with a pointed look. What grade did Maria get in math last term? She blinked, caught off guard. What? I folded my arms. You're their mom, right? So close, so involved? I figured you'd know. She blinked, flustered. Their schooling isn't the point. They're doing fine. No, they're smart kids, I said. They'll get by with a little help. That's what I mean, she said quickly. But they'd be better off if James adopted them. He can take over the tedious parts of raising them. Her words hit me like a punch. Tedious? My fists clenched, but I held my ground. You've got some nerve, Catherine. Talking about our kids like they're chores to pass off. Like I'm just a hurdle in your perfect little life with James. Her face tightened, but I didn't care. She could dress it up however she liked, but I wasn't about to hand my kids over to the man who'd already stolen everything else from me. James is a successful, respectable man, she said sharply. He's a fine role model for the kids. And you? Let's face it, you've got nothing. You were nothing. She said it like it was a fact, expecting me to crumble. James wants to help, she continued, her tone firm. I even have a $5,000 check here for you. Take it. Use it to get back on your feet and give your kids a real chance. I leaned back against the workbench, crossing my arms. Generous offer, I said slowly. But I'm happy right here in my garage. It's all I need. I let the words hang, then leaned in slightly. And I'm not selling my kids. Her face flushed with frustration, her hands curling into fists. This isn't about that, she snapped. I'm trying to do what's best for Logan and Maria. You could at least think about their future. I shook my head, a bitter smile tugging at my lips. Their future, huh? Funny how you and James only care about it when it suits you. Their future's better with a father who loves them for who they are, not as props for a perfect little picture. She opened her mouth, but I raised a hand to stop her. Don't bother, Catherine. I know exactly where I stand with you and that snake you married. Keep your check, and tell James that if he thinks he can buy my kids, he's dead wrong. Just as I turned to pour another cup of coffee, a man in a sleek black suit walked into the garage. He looked wildly out of place among the grease-streaked tools, his polished shoes untouched by dust. I'm Mr. Miller, he said, bowing slightly. The Prime Minister of Japan is on the line, awaiting your response regarding the Osaka project. I shot Catherine a glance. Her face was a mix of confusion and disbelief. Turning back to the suited man, I nodded. Bring it over. He handed me a high-tech phone, and I casually leaned against the workbench. Prime Minister Takahashi, I greeted warmly. It's always a pleasure. I've reviewed the proposal, and while we're aligned, I need to ensure our commitment to sustainability remains firm. That's non-negotiable. As the Prime Minister spoke, respectful and accommodating, Catherine's eyes widened. She shifted awkwardly, clearly blindsided. Excellent, I said after a moment. We're in agreement. My team will follow up to finalize the timeline. Thank you for your trust. I look forward to this partnership. I handed the phone back to the suited man, who bowed and left. Before Catherine could process, another man entered, carrying a folder and clipboard. He spoke briskly. Mr. Miller, We need your signature to close the $20 million land purchase. It's set to finalize today. I took the clipboard, skimmed the documents, and signed. Make sure the architects know I want something iconic for the groundbreaking, I said. We're setting the standard. Understood, sir, he replied, leaving with a nod. Catherine stared, her disbelief now complete. You? I didn't know? She stammered. I shrugged, turning back to the workbench. Guess there's a lot you didn't know, Catherine. Life's funny like that. The sharp click of heels echoed through the garage, drawing my attention to the entrance. Catherine turned too, her brow furrowing as the woman stepped in. She was stunning, exuding confidence in a sleek leather jacket and jeans, her athletic frame moving with effortless grace. Before I could say a word, she strode over, cupped my face, and kissed me, a kiss that declared to the world we were together. Pulling back, she shot Catherine a sharp, amused look, her lips curling into a smirk. Buying a whole garage just to play with your cars? Bit over the top, don't you think? She teased, then turned to Catherine, her expression unimpressed. This is your ex? Didn't you say she was good-looking? This? She waved dismissively. She's like a malnourished Shrek minus the green. Catherine's face flushed with fury. Excuse me? Is this Marina Nika, the MMA champion? How did someone like you trap her? She sputtered, her voice rising. Marina's smirk vanished as she stepped closer, her tone icy. Watch yourself, she said calmly. Normally I'd knock someone out for that. But for Andrew's sake, I'll let it slide, this time. Her voice dropped, dark and dangerous. Next time I'll make you regret it. And for the record, he didn't trap me. I chased him. Catherine paled, taking a step back as Marina turned to me, brushing a stray hair from my shoulder. You good, babe? Or should I handle this for you? I chuckled, shaking my head. You've made your point. Let's not scare her too much. Catherine opened her mouth, but no words came out. She looked between us, clearly unsure how to respond to the new version of me and the powerhouse at my side. Leaning against the desk, I folded my arms and smirked. Shocking, huh? But honestly, you cheating with my brother? Best thing that ever happened to me. Her expression tightened, but she stayed silent. I pressed on, my tone calm but cutting. The day I caught you, it was pure chance. Came home early, saw you and that maggot in my bed. I didn't even touch him. Didn't even touch you. Instead, I went to my parents thinking they'd have my back. My voice hardened as I recalled that night, but when I told them, they didn't care. My dad just sighed and said, "These things happen. Don't make a scene." Like it was a business deal. And my mom? She just wrung her hands and said, "It's best to let it go." Let it go? As if it didn't matter. I leaned forward, my voice dropping. I told them I wanted answers, justice, something. And do you know what my father said? My fists clenched as I imitated his dismissive tone. Don't make this a scandal, son. We have a reputation to protect. Let her go and move on. I laughed bitterly. Move on? Like I should just pretend none of it happened. Like my life, my trust, meant nothing to any of you. Catherine's lips parted like she wanted to argue, but my words left her silent. Her hands fidgeted in her lap, the defiance she once had now replaced with guilt and unease. She couldn't meet my gaze. You don't get to defend them, I said coldly. You can't tell me it wasn't like that, because it was. They didn't care about me. I was just the son they tolerated. Expendable whenever it suited them. Their golden boy could do no wrong. Her shoulders slumped under the weight of my words. For once, there was no defiance in her eyes, only regret, maybe even shame. So yeah, I continued, my voice sharp. The choice was easy. Stay and let them destroy me, or leave. Leave you, leave them, leave everything. I leaned in, my bitterness plain. If I'd stayed, nothing would have changed. My brother would have ruined the next woman in my life, and the next. It's what he does. The silence was heavy, suffocating. Her eyes glistened, but no tears fell. I broke the cycle, I said. Walking away was the best decision I ever made. I don't live in their shadow anymore. I'm free. Her lip quivered as she finally whispered, I didn't know it hurt you that much. You didn't think at all, Catherine, I snapped. Not about me, not about us. You were too busy chasing after him, like everyone else. I leaned back, crossing my arms. I'm done explaining myself. I don't need your understanding. I don't need you. She looked like she might respond, but stayed silent, her gaze dropping as the truth settled over her. For the first time, she seemed to understand just how deeply I'd been scarred, and how little power she had left. I smirked. The family always thought I was expendable, I said, letting the venom seep into my voice. The son they could push aside to keep their precious golden boy happy. Her unease flickered, but she stayed quiet. They made one big mistake, I said, my tone cutting. They didn't realize I wasn't just the black sheep. I was the smart one, the one who owned the patents that made Miller's Incorporated. Her eyes widened slightly, the realization dawning. Oh, you didn't know, I continued, relishing the moment. While you and James were busy playing house, I was working, designing, creating, filing patents under my name. Every wrench, drill, and custom tool that put Miller's on the map, that was me. Catherine's jaw tightened, but she didn't speak. I leaned in, my smirk curling. When I left, I didn't leave empty-handed. I took the licenses with me. And you know what I did? She shook her head faintly, curiosity betraying her silence. I started my own company, I said, sitting back with a grin. And not with a bank loan. My partner had, let's call them unconventional resources. Her brow furrowed, confusion etched across her face. A Mexican dope lord, I said casually, enjoying the shock rippling through her. He needed to clean his money, and I needed capital. Win-win. Her mouth opened and closed as she stammered. You worked with... He's legitimate now, I said, waving her off. But back then, his investment built my empire. And now, Miller's Incorporated licenses my tools and pays me royalties. Every single month. Catherine's face went pale, her hands trembling. You planned all of this? She whispered. I chuckled. Planned? No. I survived. I played the cards I was dealt, and I played them better than anyone ever expected. I leaned back, arms crossed, smirking as Catherine's jaw dropped, her wide eyes brimming with disbelief. She opened her mouth, but no words came. I gave her a moment to absorb what I'd said before twisting the knife. 2 years ago, I pulled all the licenses, I said calmly. Since then, Miller's Inc. has been sinking fast. Her lips trembled. But why? She whispered. I let out a humorless laugh. Why? Because they deserved it. James stole everything. My wife, my dignity, my future. My parents covered for him, sacrificed me to protect their favorite. So I made sure they paid. Her hands gripped the chair, her knuckles white as she pieced it together. With backing from my unconventional partner and the patents I owned, I started poaching their clients, one by one. It wasn't hard. Quality sells itself. And James, he's all talk. The man can't run a business to save his life. I leaned forward, voice dripping with disdain. While he played CEO, I built something real. Every contract they lost came to me. Now, Miller's Inc. is drowning in debt, teetering on bankruptcy. James ran it into the ground. Her face twisted with shock and fear. You destroyed them. Your own family, I scoffed. They stopped being my family when they chose him over me. I didn't destroy them, I just gave them the rope. James hung himself. Catherine's voice shook. And you think this makes you better than them? I leaned in, glaring. I don't care what it makes me, better, worse, it doesn't matter. What matters is that I'm free. They lost everything and I won. Her eyes filled with unshed tears. I didn't know you hated us so much, she whispered. Hate? I shook my head. No, Catherine. Hate takes too much energy. I don't care enough to hate. You, James, my parents, you're nothing to me now. Just ghosts of a life I left behind. I smirked, watching her struggle to process it all. The family always thought I was expendable, I said coolly. The son they could ignore and discard. But they missed one thing. I wasn't just the black sheep, I was the smart one. Every tool that put Miller's on the map, my designs, my patents. Her eyes widened. You? Yep, I said, cutting her off. And when I left, I took the licenses with me. Then I built my own company, with some unconventional funding. A retired Mexican dope lord, to be exact. He wanted a clean investment, and I needed capital. Win-win. Catherine paled, her mouth opening and closing. You worked with... Relax, I said, waving her off. It's all legitimate now. And Miller's Inc., they license my tools. Every month they pay me royalties. I leaned back, smirking. While they coddled James, I was building an empire. Mine. Her face was pale, her voice barely audible. You planned all this? No, I said with a bitter chuckle. I survived, played the cards I had, and I played them better. I let the silence linger, watching her squirm before I struck again. Let's talk about the kids. Catherine frowned, her lips twitching as if to argue, but I raised a hand. Don't interrupt, you'll want to hear this. I leaned forward. The school they attend, the one you brag about, it gets a hefty annual donation from me. I've been involved in their education, mentoring them, guiding them, watching them excel. Her eyes widened as realization hit, but she stayed silent. That's right, I continued. Every A on their report cards, every project they aced, that was me. I've been there for them every step of the way, ensuring they had what they needed. And you? You didn't even notice. Her face flushed, a mix of anger and shock, but I pressed on. They trust me, Catherine. They confide in me, their dreams, fears, struggles, and soon they'll be here with me, permanently. This isn't just about being part of their lives. It's about giving them a home where they truly belong. I leaned back, watching her crumble. You thought I was nothing, just an ant you could step on. But the ant survived the storm, and this time, the ant had the last laugh. Her face went pale, and she gave a faint shake of her head, as if she couldn't or wouldn't accept what I was saying. You assumed I vanished, Catherine, I said, my voice steady but sharp. You thought I abandoned them, just like I walked away from you. But here's the truth. All this time, I've been building something, a connection with them that you can't destroy no matter how hard you try. I stepped closer, my tone hardening. So go ahead, play your games, cling to whatever illusion of control you think you still have. It won't matter, because soon I'll be the one in charge, and they'll be calling this place home. I let the silence linger, letting my words sink in. For once, the power dynamic had shifted, and she had no moves left to make. While you were busy making unilateral decisions about their future without me, I said sharply, I was creating a real future for them, one where they're actually nurtured and guided by someone who knows what they're doing, not left in the hands of people too blinded by their own egos to see the damage they're causing. A bitter laugh escaped as I shook my head, my eyes fixed on her. Look at yourself, Catherine, all dressed up, playing trophy to James. Does he make you feel important, special? I didn't give her the chance to answer. I scoffed and waved her off. Because from where I stand, you're nothing more than a pretty accessory he shows off. A pawn to prop up his fragile ego while he hides the fact that he's barely keeping his head above water. Her jaw tightened, her eyes narrowing in defiance, but I didn't relent. Don't look at me like that. James might think he's on top of the world, but the cracks are showing. The debt? It's piling up faster than he can count. The lies, they're closing in on him. The IRS and federal investigators? They're circling. It's not a matter of if, it's when. You can't pretend to be a king while living on borrowed time. The collapse is inevitable. Her lips parted, her expression wavering between fury and disbelief. But I pushed forward, cutting her off before she could speak. You want to know what's really ironic? I continued, my voice calm but loaded with venom. Even the bank's been in on this mess. They've known about the shady deals, the misused funds, and the endless deception. Yet they kept giving him money. Do you know why? I leaned in slightly, letting a cold smile play on my lips. Because their new majority shareholder has a plan. Every loan, every extension, every so-called favor, it's all part of a strategy. A rope James has been tightening around his own neck. Her eyes widened as realization began to dawn, but I wasn't finished. And here's the kicker, I added, leaning back with an icy grin. He's so arrogant, so deluded, that he doesn't even see it coming. While he's strutting around like he's untouchable, the walls are closing in. The storm is already here, and he's oblivious. The silence that followed was heavy. Catherine stared at me, her confidence cracking. For the first time, she seemed to grasp the gravity of the situation. I leaned closer, locking eyes with her, my voice dropping to a low, steady tone. And the best part? I'm that majority shareholder. I'm the one pulling every string, orchestrating every downfall. By the time you make it back to that so-called home of yours, there won't be one left. The bank's repossessing it as we speak. That golden dream of yours and James's, the family name, the legacy, the prestige, it's all gone, reduced to rubble. I sat back, watching as her composure unraveled. Her lips moved as though she wanted to argue, but no words came. The dread in her wide eyes and restless hands spoke louder than anything she could have said. Surprised? I asked sharply. You shouldn't be. This didn't happen overnight. While James was parading his false success, I was making sure every domino was perfectly aligned. And now they're all falling. There's no stopping it. I let another moment of silence hang in the air before delivering the final blow. Oh, and about my biased parents? Their home is being repossessed too. Funny, isn't it, how the tables turn? They'll be joining you and James soon enough. It's his problem now, to figure out how to fix everything. Or, unless he's arrested first. I leaned forward, meeting her gaze head-on. Do you see it now, Catherine? The world has played your little family for fools, and now that same world is turning on James. He won't just lose everything. He'll be scrambling just like the rest of you. So sit back and watch the fireworks. It's about to get very, very ugly. Catherine stood motionless, her face flushed with disbelief as my words hung in the air, sharp and foreboding. You're bluffing, Andrew, she said, her voice tight with defiance as she fought to steady herself. This is just another one of your games. You don't have the power you think you do. She threw me a scornful glare, turned sharply, and stormed out of the garage, her heels clicking against the cold concrete. Determined to keep her composure intact, she refused to let me see her falter. She wouldn't give me the satisfaction of victory. Not now, not ever. But as she drove toward her home, the confidence she had clung to began to unravel. The house, her sanctuary, her symbol of hard-earned success, loomed before her, cold and unfeeling, like a monument to impending defeat. Stepping out of the car, she felt a weight settle on her chest. As she approached the front door, something unusual caught her eye. An official notice pinned to the doorframe. Her pulse quickened as she leaned in to read it. The bold lettering confirmed her worst fear, a repossession notice from the bank. The words blurred as the reality sank in, hitting her like a punch to the gut. This wasn't some idle threat. Andrew hadn't been bluffing. It was real. Her breath hitched and her knees threatened to buckle as she stumbled closer to the door, her mind reeling. The home she had poured her life into, the foundation of all her aspirations, was slipping away. The carefully constructed image she had built for herself was being torn apart by cold, merciless bureaucracy. The world around her seemed to fade. The noise of passing cars, the rustling of nearby trees, all of it fell away as she stood frozen in place, overwhelmed by the enormity of the moment. Her chest heaved as she struggled to steady herself, but the cruel reality refused to relent. A voice broke through her haze. "Ma'am," a man said, his tone detached, professional. The words were another blow to her already crumbling world. "I'm here for the keys." Her eyes darted to him, her expression blank with shock. "The keys?" she repeated faintly, her voice trembling as if saying the words aloud would solidify her nightmare. "Yes, ma'am. The car is being repossessed as well. I'll need the keys," he said, holding out his hand. Her stomach churned violently, and her mind swam with disbelief. Repossessed? How had everything unraveled so quickly? Her hands shook as she fumbled through her purse, finally pulling out the keys. They slipped from her trembling grasp into his waiting palm, the sound of the transfer echoing like a death knell. As the man walked away, taking the car with him, Catherine's legs gave out, and she collapsed onto the cold concrete driveway. Hot tears streamed down her face, uncontrollable and relentless, as the full weight of her reality bore down on her. Everything, her home, her stability, her carefully maintained image, was gone. The sense of helplessness clawed at her chest, and she instinctively reached for her phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed James's number. The phone rang once, twice, and again. Each unanswered ring twisted the knife deeper into her heart. Then his voicemail picked up, its impersonal tone a cold reminder of how distant he had become. She redialed, desperation overtaking her, only to meet the same void. On the third attempt, the line abruptly disconnected. His phone was off. No answer, no explanation. She sat there in stunned silence, the weight of abandonment settling over her. James wasn't coming to her rescue. No one was. The man with the car was gone. The house was no longer hers, and the last remnants of her world were slipping through her fingers. Sobs racked her body as she knelt on the unforgiving pavement, her mind racing with memories of all she had fought to protect, and all she had now lost. Her cries grew louder, raw and unfiltered, as the reality of her downfall overwhelmed her. Fear, anger, and despair collided, breaking through the fragile wall of composure she had built. Each sob was a painful reminder of how far she had fallen and how powerless she now was. Through the blur of her tears, the sound of approaching footsteps pierced her despair. She looked up, her tear-streaked face trying to focus on the figures coming toward her. It was James's parents, Richard and Evelyn, walking with somber expressions. Their concern was etched deeply into their faces as they approached the remnants of what had once been the family's proud estate. Evelyn was the first to reach her. She knelt beside Catherine, her arms wrapping around her in a gesture of comfort that was both tender and futile. She didn't say anything, just held her own tears brimming as she took in the devastation surrounding them. Catherine clung to her, the gravity of her circumstances pressing down on her like a weight too heavy to bear. Richard stood a few steps away, his face drawn and lined with years of stress. His gaze remained fixed on the repossession notice nailed to the door. His expression betrayed a mix of anger, disappointment, and quiet resignation. He had always been the family's rock, but now he looked like a man eroded by the very foundation he had worked to uphold. "James," Richard muttered bitterly, his voice tinged with disbelief. How could he let this happen? The words hung in the air like an accusation, aimed as much at himself as at his absent son. Evelyn sniffled, her arms still wrapped around Catherine, before looking up at her husband. "We need to find James. We need answers," she said, her voice shaky with a mixture of fear and anger. Richard nodded grimly, pulling out his phone. He dialed James's number, his hand trembling slightly as he stared at the repossession notice. The phone rang and rang, the sound echoing like a countdown to the end of everything. But once again, there was no answer. The phone buzzed in my hand, and I glanced at the screen. Evelyn. The name alone stirred something bitter in me, but I answered, curious to hear what she could possibly want after all this time. "Andrew," her voice came through, trembling, laced with desperation. "I need your help. James is missing. The bank has taken everything, and I don't know what's happening. He's not answering his phone and—" Her voice broke, the weight of her panic spilling through every word. I let the silence stretch, savoring the shift in power. Then I spoke, my tone cold and cutting. "You really think I care?" I asked, the words slicing through the air like a blade. "You think I give a damn about your golden boy, or about our so-called family, who only saw me when it was convenient for them?" Her sharp intake of breath was audible, and I could picture her scrambling to find the right words. For once, she didn't have the upper hand. "Andrew, please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "We've lost everything. And you've taken everything from us." A bitter laugh escaped me before I could stop it. "Taken everything?" I repeated, my voice rising with anger. "No, Evelyn. You lost everything the day you decided I didn't matter. The day you chose James over me. The day you all betrayed me." I couldn't stop the words pouring out, years of resentment bubbling to the surface. "Do you even understand what that did to me? You and James. Both of you. Not once did you care. I walked away, disappeared from your lives, and not one of you stopped to ask why. Not one of you wondered if I was dead or alive. You didn't care." Her silence was telling, but it only fueled my rage. "You were too busy worshiping James," I spat, my voice shaking with suppressed fury. "Your perfect, faultless son. And what did he do with your devotion? He tore me apart, piece by piece. He stole my wife, my life, everything I had worked for. And you just stood there. You didn't say a word. You let it happen." I could hear her breath hitch, the faint sound of a stifled sob. Good. Let her feel it. Just a fraction of the pain I'd carried for years. "You didn't even try, Evelyn," I said, my voice lowering but no less venomous. "You watched me walk away and you never looked back. I was nothing to you." The silence on the line was heavy, but I wasn't finished. "And now," I continued, my tone sharp and unforgiving, "your perfect little world is falling apart and you want me to fix it? Your house, your money, your precious life, it's all gone because of the son you chose to put on a pedestal. The same son who destroyed me. And now he's destroyed you too. Andrew, please." Her voice was barely a whisper, shaky and broken. "Don't," I snapped, cutting her off. "Don't beg me. Don't pretend now that you care. Where was this desperation when I needed you? When I was drowning? You didn't care then, and you don't care now. You just want me to save you from the mess you created." I laughed, a hollow, bitter sound. "But guess what? I don't need you, not anymore. While you were busy pretending everything was fine, I was out there rebuilding my life from the ashes of what you all destroyed. Brick by brick, I built something better. And now I get to watch it all come crashing down around you." "Andrew, we're family," she said, her voice trembling with raw emotion. "Please don't do this." "Family," I repeated, the word dripping with disdain. "You and Dad destroyed that a long time ago. You want someone to fix this? Call your golden boy. Let James clean up the mess he made. He's all you've ever cared about anyway." There was a long silence on the line, and I imagined her standing there, clutching the phone, pale and desperate. The image should have softened me, but it didn't. It was too little. Too late. "Good luck, Evelyn," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "You're going to need it." I ended the call without waiting for her response. The silence that followed was deafening, but I welcomed it. For the first time in years, I felt like I had said everything that needed to be said. There was no going back, no redemption, not for her, not for them. A week later, the news came. James was dead. Word traveled fast, as it always does with tragedies like his, but the details were as bleak as they were predictable. They found him out in the desert, sprawled face down on the cracked, sun-scorched earth, alone. Somehow, it felt fitting. A man who had spent his entire life basking in everyone else's admiration, only to discover that when the applause stopped, no one was left to stand by his side. Next to him was an empty bottle, its label faded and peeling under the relentless desert sun. The coroner called it an overdose. A tragic end to a tragic life, they said. But I knew better. James didn't stumble into tragedy. He embraced it, toyed with it, until it finally consumed him. Why was he out there, so far removed from everything and everyone, running, searching, trying to outrun the weight of his failures? I didn't know, but I could imagine it. The panic setting in as he realized the world had moved on. No savior was coming. No one cared anymore. The pedestal he had clung to for so long was gone, and with it, the illusion of his invincibility. Meanwhile, back home, the unraveling of my parents was as inevitable as it was poetic. The once magnificent house they'd so proudly flaunted was gone, replaced by a dilapidated shell of a home on the outskirts of town. I saw it once, driving by out of morbid curiosity, broken windows boarded up with warped plywood, grass devouring what used to be a manicured lawn, the paint peeling off walls that could barely hold themselves upright. It wasn't just a house, it was a reflection of their pride, shattered, abandoned, and decaying under the weight of their arrogance. I didn't stop the car, but as I passed, I felt a flicker of satisfaction. They'd held on to their illusion of superiority for so long, betting everything on James, and now it was all gone. Just like him. They'd placed their faith in a lie, and when it fell apart, they were left with nothing but memories of their delusions. And then, there was Catherine, the woman who once ruled James's world with a dazzling smile and a look that could silence a room. Now she worked in a seedy bar on the edge of town, pouring drinks for men who didn't even pretend to respect her. One night, I decided to see for myself. I sat in the corner, unnoticed, watching her. The years hadn't been kind to her. The glow she once wore like armor was gone, replaced by a tired, worn expression that couldn't hide the weight of defeat. The men jeered at her, made crass jokes, and laughed at her expense, and she took it. She smiled, played along, because what else could she do? This bar, with its dim lighting and stale beer, was her life now. A far cry from the luxury she had once flaunted as James's wife. It should have been sad, almost. But I couldn't forget the way she used to look at me, like I was beneath her. I remembered her disdain, her laughter when I walked away, convinced I'd never succeed without their approval. Now look at her. Look at all of them. James is dead. My parents are prisoners of their own failures. And Catherine? She's a shadow of who she once was, clinging to scraps in a world that couldn't care less. And me? I'm still here, stronger, unshackled from their judgment and betrayal. They thought they could destroy me, but all they did was sharpen my resolve. Watching their downfall isn't vengeance. It's balance. Catherine must have thought there was still hope, that some miracle might lift her out of the wreckage. But hope didn't live in that bar. It died there, night after night, as she endured the sneers and mocking laughter of men who saw her as nothing more than a faded relic. She endured because she had no choice. There was nowhere else for her to go. The life she once boasted about was gone, and with it, her illusions of untouchable privilege. I wondered if she ever thought about the past, if she realized the pedestal she'd stood on was built on the backs of people like me. When it came to the kids, there was no contest. I filed for custody, and the judge barely needed convincing. Catherine had no stable home, no real income, and no ability to provide for them. All she had to offer was chaos. The court saw it as clearly as I did, and the kids, they were relieved. They'd seen what I went through for them, how hard I fought to give them a better life. They didn't expect me to be perfect. They just needed someone who genuinely cared. When they moved in, I made sure they felt it. My home became theirs, a place where they were safe and valued. I didn't spoil them to win their affection. I gave them what they'd been denied for so long: stability, respect, and love. Slowly, they began to heal. Their laughter came easier, their confidence grew. They joined clubs, picked up hobbies, and started dreaming again. Watching them thrive was all the validation I needed. In the end, I wasn't seeking revenge. I was seeking justice. And I got it. Looking back, I won't deny that I was angry. Angry at Catherine, at James, at my parents for everything they had done, for the chaos they caused. But that anger didn't consume me anymore. It wasn't the thing driving me forward. My focus had shifted to the future, on my kids, on creating the stability and love they had been missing for so long. Catherine might have lost everything, but I gained something far more valuable than wealth or status. The opportunity to give my children a life where they felt safe, loved, and hopeful. That was all that mattered to me in the end. Catherine had always been headstrong, always carried herself like the world owed her something. Even when her life fell apart, that fire in her didn't die. It just burned her more than anyone else. I'd heard about her working in a rundown bar, scraping by on tips. Sometimes I almost pitied her, almost. But her choices had led her there, and I had no intention of letting her chaos pull me back into her orbit. One afternoon, Marina and I were at our favorite little cafe downtown. It wasn't anything fancy, just a cozy place where we could escape the noise of the world for a while. I remember her laughter that day, bright and carefree, the kind that makes everything else fade away. For the first time in years, I felt like I could finally breathe, like I had truly left all the bitterness and hurt behind. And then I saw Catherine. She was across the street, and before I could even process the look in her eyes, she was storming toward us. Her heels clicked against the pavement like a countdown, and the tension in her every step was palpable. The anger etched on her face was unmistakable. Her eyes locked onto me with a mix of rage and desperation. "Andrew!" she shouted, her voice sharp enough to cut through the soft hum of the cafe. Heads turned, and for a moment the whole place seemed to freeze. "How dare you move on like this? You think you can just forget everything? Forget me? Forget your family?" I set my coffee down, meeting her gaze with a calm I didn't entirely feel. "Catherine," I said evenly, keeping my tone steady, "this isn't the place for this. I've moved on. You should too." But she wasn't looking for reason. "You think you're better than me, don't you?" she spat, her voice climbing. "You took everything from me. Everything." Her hands trembled as she stepped closer, her face contorted with fury. I felt Marina shift beside me, her posture stiffening as she prepared for whatever might happen next. Before I could respond, Catherine lunged at me, her hand raised, aiming for a slap. She didn't get the chance. Marina was on her feet in an instant, stepping between us with a calm precision that was as protective as it was commanding. "That's enough," Marina said firmly, her voice low and controlled, like steel wrapped in silk. "You don't get to do this." Catherine froze mid-motion, her hands still hovering, stunned by Marina's intervention. But it didn't last. Her lips twisted into a sneer as she glared at Marina. "Who do you think you are?" she hissed. "You don't know anything about us, about him, about what he's done." Marina didn't flinch. "I know enough," she replied, her voice steady and unwavering. "I know he's moved on, and you should too. Whatever you're looking for, Catherine, you won't find it here." The venom in Catherine's eyes deepened, and she lunged again, this time aiming to shove Marina. It was a mistake. In one fluid motion, Marina sidestepped and caught Catherine's wrist. Before anyone could process what had happened, Catherine was on the ground, her arm pinned behind her back. Marina's movements were precise, practiced. She wasn't reacting. She was protecting. The cafe erupted into gasps and murmurs as Marina held Catherine firmly but without unnecessary force. "I'm showing you mercy," Marina said, her tone calm but carrying an unmistakable edge. "Don't make me regret it." Catherine stopped struggling, her anger giving way to shock and pain. When Marina released her, she staggered to her feet, clutching her wrist and glaring at Marina with a mix of humiliation and fury. Without another word, she turned and stumbled away, her pride more bruised than her body. I exhaled slowly, rising to my feet. "You didn't have to do that," I said softly, though I couldn't hide the admiration in my tone. "Yes, I did," Marina replied, her eyes meeting mine. "No one threatens you. Not her, not anyone." But Catherine wasn't done. She marched straight to the police station, spinning a tale about being attacked without provocation. She played the sufferer, her tears painting a picture of a defenseless woman wronged by someone out of control. She demanded justice, clinging to the belief that she could regain some semblance of power through the legal system. Catherine's story fell apart the moment the cafe's security footage came into play. The video painted an undeniable picture. Catherine storming toward me, her anger escalating until she tried to strike, and then turning her fury on Marina. The recording showed Marina's actions as calm, calculated, and entirely in self-defense, a sharp contrast to Catherine's reckless aggression. When the case reached court, the judge watched the evidence with an unwavering gaze. Their voice was stern as they addressed Catherine. "The video is clear," the judge stated. "You were the aggressor in this incident. Marina's actions were not only justified but measured under the circumstances. This case is dismissed." The sharp crack of the gavel silenced the courtroom, the finality echoing in the hushed air. The judge's expression hardened as they turned their attention back to Catherine. "Miss Catherine Lewis," they began, their voice heavy with reproach, "your conduct has been nothing short of disgraceful. The evidence doesn't support your claims of suffererhood. Instead, it reveals a troubling pattern of hostility and vindictiveness. This is not the behavior of someone seeking justice. It is the behavior of someone intent on causing damage." Catherine flinched, her confidence crumbling under the weight of the judge's words. "Let me be clear," the judge continued. "Any further attempts to contact or confront Mr. Andrew Carter, his fiancée Marina, or their children will not be tolerated. You are hereby ordered to stay at least 500 feet away from them at all times. This restraining order is effective immediately and will remain in place indefinitely. Any violation will result in severe legal consequences." The courtroom was still except for the rhythmic tapping of the stenographer's keys. Catherine's cheeks burned as she stared down at the floor, the murmurs of the onlookers adding to her humiliation. Every eye in the room seemed to pierce her, each gaze a reflection of her disgrace. For the first time, the full reality of her choices weighed on her. Once admired and envied, Catherine had fallen far from the pedestal she once occupied. Now, stripped of her dignity, she sat exposed for all to see, a woman whose bitterness had consumed her. Her attempts to disrupt my life and cling to the past had only highlighted her descent. The gavel struck again, ending the hearing. Catherine rose from her seat, her movements slow and deliberate, as though each step carried the weight of her shame. She avoided eye contact with anyone as she exited the courtroom, her head bowed, her pride in tatters. For the first time, the consequences of her actions seemed to fully register. She was alone, isolated by her own choices, with no one left to blame but herself. Marina, meanwhile, stood tall and composed, her name cleared and her integrity intact. As we walked out of the courtroom together, I placed my arm around her shoulders. "That was a lot," I said, exhaling the tension that had lingered through the proceedings. Marina smiled softly, her confidence as steady as ever. "She needed to learn that actions have consequences," she replied. Marina's steadfast presence had become the anchor in my life. When we exchanged vows in a small, intimate ceremony, surrounded by close friends and family, it felt like the culmination of everything we had fought for: love, healing, and renewal. For me, it wasn't just about starting a new chapter. It was about building a life on my own terms, free from the chaos of the past. Marina embraced her role in our family wholeheartedly. With her background in martial arts, she began teaching the kids not just self-defense, but also discipline, confidence, and resilience. What started as casual lessons quickly turned into a cherished routine. She taught them far more than physical skills. She instilled in them values of integrity, perseverance, and kindness. Under her guidance, the kids began to thrive. Their laughter grew louder, their spirits lighter, and their dreams bolder. Marina's influence became a cornerstone of their growth, helping them rebuild their sense of self and purpose. Watching them flourish filled me with a deep gratitude I could hardly put into words. For the first time in years, my life felt whole, filled with love, stability, and the promise of a brighter future. Together, Marina and I created a home where the kids felt safe and cherished, a stark contrast to the turbulence they had endured before. Catherine, on the other hand, faded into the shadows of her own making. The once vibrant woman who had thrived on attention and admiration was now consumed by regret and loneliness. Isolated and bitter, she watched from afar as my family and I moved forward, our happiness a painful reminder of everything she had lost. Each decision she had made, every bridge she had burned, had led her further into solitude. Sitting alone in her small apartment, she was no longer the center of anyone's world, no longer admired, envied, or relevant. But I didn't dwell on Catherine's fate. I refused to let the past define me. With Marina by my side, I focused on building a life rooted in love, resilience, and joy. Together, we became partners in every sense, shaping a family and a future that reflected the strength we had found through adversity. For the first time, I wasn't just surviving, I was thriving. And that was the real victory. The past, with all its betrayals, heartbreak, and lessons, feels like a distant storm now. A storm that once battered me relentlessly but ultimately passed, leaving the skies clear and calm. The scars remain, of course. They always do. But instead of bitterness, they carry a quiet strength, a testament to what I've endured and what I've built from the ashes. In my workshop, surrounded by the tools of my trade, the hum of creativity fills the air. It's a comforting sound, one that reminds me of who I am, a builder, a creator, a survivor. Across the room, Marina is laughing, her voice light and joyous as the kids animatedly recount their day. The sight makes me pause, a warm sense of contentment washing over me. This is my life now, simple, authentic, and full of love. The echoes of Catherine, James, and my family's betrayal still linger faintly like distant thunder, but they no longer carry the power to haunt me. They're simply reminders, markers of a past that shaped me but no longer defines me. I used to think revenge would heal me, that seeing their downfall would bring me peace. But the truth is, my peace didn't come from their failures. It came from letting go. It came from building something new, something entirely mine. Marina, with her steadfast strength and unwavering love, has become the cornerstone of this new life. She doesn't just stand beside me. She stands with me, lifting me up, grounding me when the world feels unsteady. And the kids, they've flourished. Their laughter is louder, their smiles brighter, their dreams bolder. Together, we've created a home where they feel safe, valued, and loved, a stark contrast to the turbulence they once knew. As I watch them, I realize the greatest victory isn't in seeing those who wronged me falter. It's in knowing I've created a life they could never take away. A life rooted in love, resilience, and hope. This is the legacy I'm leaving, not one of bitterness or revenge, but one of growth, strength, and unwavering truth. And so I live, not just surviving, but thriving with Marina and the kids by my side. We've built a sanctuary, a place where the past holds no power and the future is bright with promise. For the first time in years, I feel whole. And in this quiet contentment, I find the true meaning of freedom.